The Selenar Gene-Cults emerged from Luna's irradiated wastes during humanity's darkest age, when old Earth writhed under the boot of techno-barbarian warlords, and the galaxy burned with the fires of madness. While Terra descended into an abyss of nuclear winter and endless warfare, Luna's gene rights carved their dominion into the ancient crater cities and sprawling subterranean complexes that honeycomb the moon's interior. These fortress laboratories, some dating back to the dark age of technology, became sanctuaries of forbidden knowledge where the Selenar perfected arts that would make them indispensable to the powers emerging from Terra's radioactive dust. The Gene-Cults did not arise from a single source or ideology. They coalesced from the remnants of pre-strife genetic research facilities, rogue bioenhancement corporations, and radical gene smiths who fled Terra's collapse. Luna's reduced gravity and sealed environments provided ideal conditions for genetic experimentation, while its distance from Terra's worst excesses offered a measure of protection from the warlords who carved up humanity's birth world. The crater cities of Luna had maintained their atmospheric seals and life support systems through the age of strife, creating isolated pockets of civilization where scientific pursuit could continue even as Terra regressed into barbarism. Within these sealed environments, the proto-Selenar began their work in earnest. They salvaged genetic databases from the Dark Age, repositories of human genome mapping that predated the strife by millennia. These archives contained the accumulated knowledge of humanity's golden age, when genetic manipulation had reached heights that would not be matched again until the Emperor's own experiments. The early gene rights studied these records with religious fervor, treating each fragment of recovered data as holy scripture. They learned to read the language of chromosomes and base pairs, to understand the intricate dance of genes that determined every aspect of human development. The techniques they developed went far beyond simple genetic screening or crude mutation. The Selenar mastered zygotic manipulation, the art of altering genetic material at the moment of conception. This allowed them to guide human development from its earliest stages, creating changes that would express themselves naturally rather than through invasive surgery or chemical treatment. They could strengthen bones, enhance muscle fiber density, improve neural pathway formation, and heighten sensory acuity, all through carefully calculated genetic modification. These alterations bred true, creating bloodlines of enhanced humans who passed their advantages to their offspring. Controlled mutation became another cornerstone of Selenar expertise. Unlike the chaotic mutations that plagued the wider galaxy, the Gene-Cults learned to induce specific, beneficial changes while suppressing harmful variations. They developed techniques to trigger dormant genetic sequences, activating traits that lay hidden within human DNA. Some of these sequences appeared to be ancient, predating recorded history, suggesting that humanity's genome contained layers of evolutionary heritage that standard development never expressed. The Selenar learned to awaken these sleeping giants, producing humans with capabilities that seemed impossible by natural means. The Gene-Cults organized themselves into distinct lineages, each specializing in particular aspects of genetic science. Some focused on warrior enhancement, developing techniques to create superior soldiers. Others specialized in environmental adaptation, crafting humans who could survive in hostile conditions. Still others pursued cognitive enhancement, seeking to elevate human intelligence and mental capacity. These lineages competed and collaborated in equal measure, trading techniques and genetic samples while jealously guarding their most valuable secrets. The culture that developed within Luna's gene vaults was simultaneously cooperative and cutthroat, driven by scientific ambition and the constant need to maintain relevance in a universe that had little patience for weakness. As the Unification Wars consumed Terra, the Selenar found themselves in a position of unprecedented importance. The warlords battling for control of humanity's birth world required soldiers, and not just ordinary troops. They needed enhanced warriors capable of surviving the radioactive hellscapes of Terra, fighting in toxic environments, and matching the horrors that emerged from rival gene forges. The Selenar provided these warriors, selling their services to the highest bidders while maintaining careful neutrality in the conflicts themselves. They supplied gene-modified servants to the Pan-Pacific Empire, enhanced troops to the Nordific conclaves, and specialized combat units to dozens of smaller powers. The warriors produced in Luna's gene forges varied tremendously in capability and modification. Some received relatively minor enhancements, improvements to endurance and strength that made them superior to baseline humans without fundamentally altering their nature. Others underwent more radical transformation, their bodies reshaped into living weapons optimized for specific combat roles. The Selenar created infiltrators with enhanced cognitive function and social manipulation abilities, heavy assault troops with reinforced skeletal structures and hyper-dense musculature, and specialized operatives adapted to survive in environments that would kill unmodified humans within minutes. The Gene-Cults maintained detailed records of every modification they performed, building vast genetic libraries that cataloged successful techniques and failed experiments alike. These archives grew with each generation, accumulating knowledge that made the Selenar increasingly indispensable. No other organization possessed their depth of understanding or breadth of practical experience. While Terra's warlords commanded crude gene forges that produced unstable mutants and short-lived abominations, the Selenar delivered consistent results backed by centuries of refinement. Their monopoly on advanced genetic sciences became the foundation of Selenar independence. The Gene-Cults understood that their survival depended on making themselves too valuable to conquer and too dangerous to ignore. They cultivated relationships with multiple Terran powers simultaneously, ensuring that no single faction could claim their exclusive service. When one warlord grew too demanding, the Selenar would shift their support to rivals, maintaining a delicate balance that preserved their autonomy. They fortified Luna's crater cities with defensive systems that made invasion prohibitively costly, and they seeded their client armies with genetic kill switches that could be activated if those forces turned against their creators. The establishment of true Selenar sovereignty came gradually, through accumulated precedent rather than formal declaration. The Gene-Cults began refusing certain contracts, rejecting commissions that would compromise their neutrality or force them to take sides in Terra's conflicts. They demanded payment in resources rather than allegiance, stockpiling the materials necessary to maintain their independence. Luna's underground complexes expanded steadily, burrowing deeper into the moon's crust to create layered defenses that could withstand orbital bombardment. The Selenar invested in their own security forces, enhanced warriors who owed loyalty only to the Gene-Cults themselves. The culture within Luna's gene vaults reflected their unique position. The Selenar saw themselves as humanity's genetic custodians, preserving and advancing the science of human enhancement while the rest of the species tore itself apart. They viewed their work with clinical detachment, treating human subjects as raw material to be refined and improved. This perspective created a society that valued genetic purity and scientific achievement above traditional human concerns. The Gene-Rights formed dynasties based on genetic lineage and demonstrated skill, creating hierarchies that rewarded innovation and punished failure. Their laboratories sprawled through Luna's interior, vast complexes where thousands of technicians and gene smiths labored over their craft. Gestation chambers lined kilometer-long corridors, each containing developing subjects at various stages of modification. Analysis centers processed genetic data around the clock, searching for new combinations and improvements. Training facilities tested enhanced warriors, pushing them to their limits to verify the effectiveness of modifications. The scale of Selenar operations dwarfed anything attempted on Terra, supported by infrastructure that had survived the age of strife largely intact. The Gene-Cults developed their own aesthetic, a clinical brutalism that reflected their scientific focus. Luna's facilities featured stark white corridors lit by harsh luminators, sterile environments where contamination could be instantly detected and eliminated. The Selenar themselves often bore visible signs of their craft, subtle enhancements that marked them as products of their own techniques. Many possessed unusual eye colors, the result of genetic modifications that improved vision. Others showed the enhanced physiques that came from optimized metabolism and muscle development. These markers of modification served as status symbols within Selenar society, visible proof of genetic superiority. The physical manifestations of Selenar power stood as monuments to genetic science and paranoid defensibility. Luna's crater cities served as the visible face of gene-cult dominion, but the true heart of their empire lay in the fortress complexes carved deep beneath the moon's surface. These installations descended through layers of ancient rock and processed regolith, their lowest levels reaching depths where Luna's meager gravity barely registered, and the eternal cold of the void pressed against reinforced bulkheads. The largest and most significant of these strongholds centered on Artemisium, a crater city that predated the Age of Strife and had served as a major genetic research hub during humanity's golden age. Artemisium's surface structures occupied the crater's interior, a sprawling complex of domes and sealed hab blocks that housed the administrative apparatus of the Selenar Gene-Cults. The crater walls, rising several kilometers above the installation, provided natural protection against lateral assault, while massive void shields flickered in the airless dark above, ready to deflect orbital strikes. The visible portions of Artemisium served primarily as reception facilities for clients arriving from Terra, processing centers where contracts were negotiated and initial genetic assessments performed. These surface levels maintained an atmosphere of clinical efficiency, with wide corridors connecting specialized consultation chambers where gene wrights discussed modifications with potential customers. The real work occurred far below. Access to the lower levels required passage through multiple security checkpoints, each employing gene-locked verification systems that analyzed cellular samples from anyone seeking entry. These locks read DNA sequences with precision that made conventional security measures obsolete. Only individuals whose genetic markers matched authorized templates could proceed deeper, and the Selenar maintained strict control over who received such authorization. The gene locks themselves represented sophisticated Dark Age technology that the Selenar had maintained and refined, systems that could detect genetic tampering, identify cloned infiltrators, and recognize authorized personnel even if they had undergone significant physical modification. Beyond the gene-locked barriers, the fortress complexes opened into vast underground spaces carved from Luna's bedrock. The primary gene laboratories occupied chambers large enough to house entire city blocks, their ceilings supported by massive pillars of reinforced ferrocrete. These spaces contained the gestation facilities where the Selenar performed their craft, row upon row of amniotic tanks and growth chambers where modified humans developed under constant monitoring. Each laboratory specialized in particular modification types, with separate facilities dedicated to warrior enhancement, environmental adaptation, cognitive improvement, and dozens of other specializations. The scale of operations in these chambers defied easy comprehension, with thousands of subjects undergoing modification simultaneously. The laboratories themselves featured multiple redundant systems designed to maintain precise environmental control. Temperature regulation kept the facilities at optimal levels for genetic work, while atmospheric processors ensured perfect air quality free from contaminants that might compromise delicate procedures. Rad shielding lined every wall and ceiling, protecting against Luna's harsh radiation environment and preventing external interference with sensitive genetic material. The Selenar had learned through bitter experience that even minor radiation exposure could corrupt genetic sequences, introducing mutations that cascaded through developing subjects and ruined months of careful work. The rad shields employed layered defense, combining physical barriers with active field generators that deflected particle radiation. Security within the fortress complexes extended far beyond gene-locked doors. The Selenar maintained substantial garrison forces composed of their own enhanced warriors, clone soldiers grown in Luna's vaults and conditioned from birth to serve the Gene-Cults. These garrison troops represented some of the finest examples of Selenar craft, warriors who combined superior physical capabilities with unwavering loyalty programmed at the genetic level. Unlike the enhanced soldiers sold to Terran warlords, garrison clones received modifications that made them unsuitable for independent operation. Their neural architecture included dependencies that required regular genetic maintenance, ensuring they could never survive long away from Selenar facilities. The garrison forces organized into specialized units matching the threats they might face. Heavy assault clones, their bodies reinforced with subdermal armor plating and enhanced skeletal structures, defended primary access points and critical facilities. These warriors stood over 2 meters tall, their frames packed with hyper-dense muscle tissue that gave them strength far exceeding baseline human limits. They carried weapons designed specifically for their enhanced physiology, heavy bolters and conversion beamers that would cripple unmodified soldiers with their recoil. Lighter reconnaissance units patrolled the endless corridors of the fortress complexes, their enhanced senses capable of detecting intruders through multiple sensory channels. Some possessed thermal vision that could track heat signatures through walls, while others featured auditory enhancement that picked up heartbeats at considerable distances. The defensive architecture of Selenar holdings incorporated lessons learned across millennia of conflict. Corridors featured multiple choke points where defenders could concentrate fire against advancing enemies, with automated weapon systems covering approaches from concealed positions. Blast doors capable of sealing entire sections could be activated instantly, compartmentalizing the fortress complexes to contain breaches. The Selenar had designed their strongholds to function even under sustained assault, with independent life support systems for each major section and stockpiles of supplies sufficient to endure years-long sieges. Power generation occurred in multiple redundant facilities scattered throughout the complexes, ensuring that losing any single generator would not compromise overall operations. The gene repositories represented the most heavily defended areas within the fortress complexes, bio-vaults containing the accumulated genetic knowledge of the Selenar Gene-Cults. These repositories stored physical samples alongside digital records, maintaining genetic material in cryogenic suspension, while data archives preserved the information necessary to replicate successful modifications. The oldest samples dated back to the Dark Age of technology, genetic templates from humanity's golden age, when enhancement sciences had reached their apex. The Selenar guarded these ancient templates with fanatical devotion, understanding that they represented irreplaceable resources that could never be recovered if lost. The bio-vaults themselves occupied the deepest levels of the fortress complexes, positioned where they would survive even if the upper levels suffered catastrophic damage. Each vault featured its own independent power supply, life support, and defensive systems, effectively functioning as a fortress within the larger complex. Access required passage through multiple gene-locked barriers, with each checkpoint demanding progressively higher authorization levels. The innermost vaults could be accessed only by the most senior gene wrights, masters of the craft who had demonstrated both technical expertise and absolute loyalty to the Selenar cause. Within the vaults, genetic material resided in organized arrays that reflected centuries of careful cataloging. Temperature-controlled storage units maintained samples at precise cryogenic temperatures, while monitoring systems tracked every container and logged any access. The Selenar had developed classification systems that organized genetic templates by modification type, source lineage, success rate, and dozens of other criteria. A gene wright seeking a particular enhancement could navigate these archives to find relevant templates, comparing historical examples and selecting optimal base material for new projects. The depth of information available in the repositories gave the Selenar tremendous advantages over any potential competitors, allowing them to draw on proven techniques rather than relying on experimental approaches. The repositories also contained forbidden knowledge, genetic sequences, and modification techniques that the Selenar had deemed too dangerous for general use. Some of these forbidden templates produced subjects with severe psychological instabilities, warriors whose enhanced aggression made them uncontrollable. Others created physical capabilities that came with crippling dependencies, modifications that required constant medical intervention to prevent catastrophic organ failure. The Selenar preserved these failed experiments as cautionary examples and research material, maintaining them under the strictest security protocols. Access to forbidden templates required authorization from the highest levels of gene cult hierarchy, and even then occurred only under carefully controlled circumstances. Pre-Old Night biological archives occupied special sections within the repositories, ancient records salvaged from Dark Age facilities. These archives contain genetic information that predated the strife by thousands of years, samples and data from humanity's expansion across the stars. The Selenar had recovered some of these materials from abandoned research stations and derelict colony ships, while others had survived within Luna's own facilities since before the collapse. The pre-Old Night archives included baseline human templates from dozens of colony worlds, showing the natural genetic variation that had developed across human populations before the Age of Strife isolated these communities. They also contained records of enhancement techniques developed during the Dark Age, sophisticated modifications that the Selenar had spent centuries attempting to understand and replicate. Luna's political landscape extended beyond the Selenar Gene-Cults, and the fortress complexes existed within a broader context of competing factions and uneasy alliances. The tech cults that maintained Luna's ancient infrastructure operated their own enclaves, worshipping the machine spirits of Dark Age systems and hoarding technological secrets. These tech cults shared the moon with the Selenar, but pursued different obsessions, focusing on mechanical enhancement rather than genetic modification. Relations between the gene cults and tech cults remained cordial but distant, with each faction recognizing the other's expertise while maintaining clear boundaries. The Selenar occasionally contracted tech cult services for maintenance of particularly complex systems, while the tech cults sometimes sought genetic modifications for their own members. Mining cartels controlled access to Luna's mineral resources, operating extraction facilities in the highlands and far side regions. These cartels had existed since before the Age of Strife, their operations continuing through the collapse and subsequent Dark Age. They provided raw materials essential for maintaining Luna's infrastructure, mining rare elements from the moon's crust and processing them in orbital refineries. The Selenar maintained trade relationships with major mining cartels, exchanging genetic services for priority access to materials needed for their operations. Some cartel families had received Selenar enhancements across multiple generations, creating bloodlines adapted specifically for work in Luna's low-gravity environment and harsh radiation conditions. The remnants of ancient colony administrations persisted in several crater cities, bureaucratic organizations that claimed descent from the original lunar colonial government. These administrations held little real power, but maintained extensive records and provided coordination services that helped prevent conflicts between Luna's various factions. The Selenar recognized these administrative bodies as useful neutral parties, organizations that could mediate disputes without threatening gene cult interests. The administrators occasionally commissioned Selenar services for their own personnel, though they could rarely afford the most sophisticated modifications. The fortress complexes served as more than military installations and research facilities. They functioned as complete societies unto themselves, housing thousands of gene rights, technicians, support staff, and garrison forces. The Selenar had created self-sufficient communities within their strongholds, with residential sections, recreational facilities, and educational institutions all contained within the protected depths. Children born within the complexes underwent genetic screening from birth, their potential assessed, and their development guided toward roles within Selenar society. Those showing aptitude for genetic sciences received intensive education in the arts of gene craft, while others trained for support roles or military service. The Selenar organized their society according to principles that reflected their fundamental obsession with genetic hierarchy and scientific achievement. At the apex of this structure stood the matriarchs, senior gene rights who had demonstrated mastery of the craft through decades of successful work and had accumulated sufficient political power to dominate entire gene cults. These women, for the Selenar leadership, remained exclusively female in accordance with traditions dating back to the Dark Age, controlled access to the most valuable genetic templates, and directed the strategic priorities of their respective organizations. The matriarchs typically achieved their positions through a combination of technical brilliance and ruthless political maneuvering, eliminating rivals and absorbing smaller gene cults to expand their power bases. Below the matriarchs existed the clade mistresses, specialists who commanded particular branches of genetic science within their gene cults. A single major gene cult might include dozens of clade mistresses, each responsible for specific modification types or research programs. The Clade Mistress of Warrior Enhancement would oversee all projects related to creating superior soldiers, while the Clade Mistress of Cognitive Improvement directed efforts to enhance human intelligence and mental capacity. These positions required both technical expertise and administrative capability, as Clade Mistresses managed teams of lesser gene rights and allocated resources among competing projects. Competition between clade mistresses within the same gene cult could be fierce, with each seeking to demonstrate the superiority of their specialization and claim greater shares of available resources. The lesser gene rights formed the bulk of Selenar technical personnel, practitioners who had completed their training and earned the right to perform genetic modifications under supervision. These individuals spent years mastering the fundamentals of gene craft, learning to read genetic sequences, operate modification equipment, and understand the complex interactions between different genetic alterations. A newly elevated gene right might spend decades working on relatively simple enhancements before being trusted with more sophisticated projects. The Selenar maintained exacting standards for their craft, and gene rights who produced flawed work faced severe consequences ranging from demotion to execution, depending on the severity of their failures. Supporting the gene rights existed vast numbers of clone servitors, vat-grown workers designed for specific tasks within the fortress complexes. These servitors represented a lower tier of Selenar genetic work, subjects created with limited cognitive function and bodies optimized for particular labor roles. Maintenance servitors possessed enhanced dexterity and the ability to work in hazardous environments, while laboratory servitors featured improved fine motor control for delicate technical work. The Selenar created these servitors with deliberately limited lifespans and built in genetic dependencies that prevented them from surviving outside controlled environments. Unlike the more sophisticated clones used for military purposes, servitors required minimal resources and could be produced in enormous numbers to handle routine tasks. The hierarchical structure extended beyond formal positions to encompass complex webs of patronage and obligation. Junior gene rights attached themselves to more senior practitioners, seeking mentorship and access to valuable genetic templates in exchange for loyalty and service. These relationships often persisted across generations, with entire lineages of gene rights serving particular matriarchal houses. The most successful gene rights accumulated their own networks of clients and dependents, building power bases that could eventually support bids for clade mistress positions or even matriarchal status. The Selenar understood that technical skill alone proved insufficient for advancement. Political acumen and the ability to build alliances determined who rose to positions of real authority. The specific techniques employed by the Selenar in their gene craft drew on knowledge accumulated across millennia, combining pre-strife science with innovations developed during the Age of Strife and the Unification era. Accelerated gestation formed a cornerstone of their work, allowing the production of mature subjects in a fraction of the time required for natural development. The Selenar had perfected growth acceleration to the point where they could produce a physically mature human in less than a standard year, though such rapid development required constant monitoring and adjustment to prevent catastrophic failures. The process involved carefully controlled hormone treatments, nutrient optimization, and genetic triggers that activated accelerated cell division while maintaining proper organ development. Accelerated gestation occurred within specialized amniotic tanks that provided developing subjects with optimal conditions throughout their growth. These tanks regulated temperature, chemical composition, and nutrient delivery with precision measured in parts per billion, maintaining environments that supported the extreme metabolic demands of accelerated development. Monitoring systems tracked thousands of developmental markers simultaneously, alerting gene writes to any deviations from expected parameters. The tanks incorporated fail-safes that could slow or halt growth if problems emerged, though such interventions often resulted in flawed subjects that required termination. The Selenar accepted high failure rates as an inevitable consequence of accelerated gestation, maintaining that speed of production justified the wastage of genetic material. Genetic memory imprinting represented one of the Selenar's most sophisticated and controversial techniques, allowing them to encode information directly into developing neural tissue. This process went far beyond simple conditioning or hypnotic suggestion, instead altering the fundamental structure of memory formation to implant knowledge that subjects experienced as natural recall. A warrior grown with genetic memory imprinting would emerge from the gestation tank already possessing combat skills, weapon familiarity, and tactical knowledge that would normally require years of training to acquire. The technique worked by identifying and activating specific genetic sequences that influenced memory consolidation, then using targeted chemical treatments during critical developmental windows to establish neural pathways encoding desired information. The limitations of genetic memory imprinting remained significant despite the Selenar's expertise. The technique could only implant procedural knowledge and basic information, not true understanding or creative thinking. A subject with imprinted combat skills would know how to fire a weapon and execute standard tactics, but lacked the judgment and adaptability of a naturally trained warrior. More complex knowledge proved increasingly difficult to imprint successfully, with failure rates rising dramatically when attempting to encode sophisticated technical information or abstract concepts. The Selenar used genetic memory, imprinting primarily for creating specialized servitors and basic military clones, reserving more intensive training methods for subjects intended for complex roles. The creation of specialized gene casts represented another major focus of Selenar work, producing distinct human subspecies optimized for particular environments or tasks. These casts went beyond simple enhancement, fundamentally altering human physiology to create beings adapted for specific niches. Void-adapted casts featured enhanced radiation resistance, modified circulatory systems that functioned efficiently in low-pressure environments, and skeletal structures reinforced against the effects of microgravity. Thermal casts could survive in extreme temperature ranges that would kill baseline humans, their metabolisms adjusted to function in conditions far outside normal parameters. Toxic environment casts possessed enhanced liver and kidney function, allowing them to process substances that would prove lethal to unmodified humans. The gene casts typically bred true, passing their modifications to offspring and creating stable breeding populations. The Selenar viewed these casts as products rather than people, selling entire populations to clients who needed workers adapted for hostile colony worlds or specialized industrial environments. Some castes had existed for multiple generations by the time of unification, their members having never known existence outside their designated roles. The Selenar maintained careful control over caste reproduction, ensuring that genetic lines remained pure and modifications expressed consistently across generations. They culled individuals who showed undesirable variations, maintaining strict quality control that prevented genetic drift from degrading their products. The philosophical framework underlying Selenar Genecraft combined scientific rationalism with mystical elements that bordered on religious devotion. The Gene Rites viewed genetic manipulation as both empirical science and sacred art, a discipline that required technical expertise and spiritual understanding in equal measure. They believed that the human genome contained divine patterns, fundamental structures that reflected the underlying order of the universe. Genetic modification, in this view, represented not mere tinkering with biology, but the revelation and perfection of these divine patterns. The Selenar saw themselves as artists working with the most profound medium imaginable, shaping the very essence of humanity according to principles that transcended mundane concerns. This philosophical approach manifested in the reverence the Selenar showed for Selene, the ancient goddess associated with Luna since pre-spaceflight antiquity. The Gene-Cults maintained that Selene embodied the principles of transformation and perfection, her eternal cycle of waxing and waning, reflecting the process of genetic refinement. Shrines to Selene occupied prominent positions within the fortress complexes, chambers where gene rites could contemplate the mysteries of their craft and seek inspiration for their work. These shrines featured imagery combining ancient lunar symbolism with representations of genetic structures, double helixes intertwining with crescent moons and stars. The Selenar performed rituals before beginning major projects, ceremonies that invoked Selene's blessing and asked for guidance in their manipulations. The religious aspects of Selenar culture coexisted uneasily with their scientific rigor, creating a worldview that acknowledged both empirical reality and mystical significance. Gene rites would spend hours analyzing genetic sequences with clinical precision, then retire to meditation chambers where they contemplated the spiritual meaning of their discoveries. This duality reflected deeper contradictions within Selenar society, an organization that prided itself on rationality while embracing beliefs that defied scientific explanation. The matriarchs encouraged this philosophical framework, understanding that it provided meaning and motivation for work that could otherwise seem coldly mechanical. The eugenic programs undertaken by the Selenar represented their most ambitious and controversial activities, systematic efforts to improve baseline human stock through selective breeding and genetic purification. The Gene-Cults maintained that humanity had degraded during the Age of Strife, accumulating harmful mutations and losing beneficial traits that had existed during the Dark Age. Their eugenic programs aimed to reverse this decline, identifying and eliminating genetic flaws while preserving and enhancing desirable characteristics. The Selenar applied these programs both to their own population and to client groups willing to submit to multi-generational improvement schemes. Genetic purification involved extensive screening of potential breeding stock, identifying individuals who carried optimal genetic templates and encouraging their reproduction, while preventing those with inferior genetics from passing on their traits. The Selenar employed ruthless standards in these assessments, culling individuals who failed to meet their criteria regardless of other qualities those individuals might possess. A person of great intelligence or artistic talent would be deemed worthless if their genetic profile showed markers associated with inherited diseases or suboptimal physical development. The Gene-Cults maintained detailed genetic registries tracking bloodlines across generations, recording every modification and natural variation to guide future breeding decisions. Enhancement programs built on the foundation of genetic purification, introducing beneficial modifications into clean bloodlines. The Selenar would identify families that had undergone successful purification and offer them enhancements designed to elevate their capabilities beyond baseline human norms. These enhancements typically focused on broadly beneficial traits rather than specialized modifications, improvements to immune function, cognitive capacity, and physical resilience that would prove valuable regardless of specific circumstances. The goal was to create superior baseline humans who could serve as foundation stock for more specialized modifications if needed. The Selenar's eugenic work attracted criticism even during the Unification era, when standards for ethical conduct remained far more flexible than in later periods. Critics argued that the Gene-Cults treated human beings as livestock, reducing people to their genetic components and ignoring qualities that could not be measured in base pairs and chromosomes. The Selenar dismissed such objections as sentimentality from those who lacked the vision to pursue true human improvement. They maintained that their work served humanity's long-term interests, that the creation of genetically superior populations would benefit the species as a whole regardless of the cost to individuals. The gene rites pointed to their successes, the enhanced warriors and adapted workers who performed beyond baseline human capability, as proof that their methods produced results. The Thunder Warriors who first breached Luna's orbital defense perimeter came as harbingers of a new order that would tolerate no rivals. These towering warriors, their bodies swollen with genetic augmentation and their minds burned hollow by combat stimulants, represented the Emperor's early attempts at creating superhuman soldiers. They lacked the refinement that would characterize later Astartes, but their raw physical power exceeded anything the Selenar had produced for their Terran clients. The initial assault waves struck Luna's outer installations during the final phases of Terran unification, when the Emperor's forces had consolidated control over humanity's birthworld and turned their attention to the moon's Gene-Cults. The Emperor's strategic calculus regarding Luna reflected both pragmatism and long-term vision. He required the Selenar's genetic expertise for his own projects, particularly the development of the Legion's Astartes, but he could not permit an independent power to exist so close to Terra. The Gene-Cults controlled knowledge and resources that would prove essential to his plans for human expansion across the galaxy, yet their autonomy represented an unacceptable challenge to Imperial authority. The Luna campaigns thus aimed not at extermination, but at forced incorporation, a military operation designed to break Selenar independence while preserving their capabilities for Imperial use. The Selenar detected the Imperial buildup weeks before the first attacks commenced. Their observation stations tracked the concentration of forces in Terran orbit, noting the construction of assault craft and the marshalling of Thunder Warriors in orbital staging areas. The matriarchs convened emergency councils within Artemisium's deepest chambers, debating responses to the impending invasion. Some argued for immediate submission, recognizing that the Emperor's forces vastly outnumbered anything the Gene-Cults could field. Others insisted on resistance, believing that the Selenar could inflict sufficient casualties to force negotiated terms rather than unconditional surrender. The councils ultimately chose defiance, calculating that their fortress complexes and enhanced defenders would exact such a toll that the Emperor would prefer compromise to protracted siege warfare. The Selenar activated defense protocols that had remained dormant since the Age of Strife, bringing ancient weapon systems online and mobilizing their garrison forces. Clone warriors emerged from gestation facilities ahead of schedule, their development accelerated despite the risks of producing flawed subjects. The Gene-Cults deployed their most sophisticated military creations, warriors who represented decades of refinement and incorporated modifications that pushed the boundaries of stable human genetics. These defenders took positions throughout the fortress complexes, preparing to contest every corridor and chamber against the coming assault. The first Imperial attacks targeted Luna's surface installations, Thunder Warriors descending in armored drop pods that punched through the moon's negligible atmosphere and struck with kinetic force that cratered the regolith. The assault forces hit multiple sites simultaneously, attempting to overwhelm Selenar defenses through sheer weight of numbers and ferocity of attack. At the mining settlements in Luna's highlands, Thunder Warriors encountered minimal resistance from workers who possessed neither the training nor equipment to oppose transhuman soldiers. These settlements fell within hours, their populations subdued, and their facilities seized to serve as forward bases for deeper assaults. The crater cities presented more substantial obstacles. Their void shields absorbed the initial bombardment from Imperial orbital assets, while defensive batteries returned fire against approaching drop craft. Selenar garrison forces engaged Thunder Warriors at the crater rims, fighting from prepared positions that maximized their defensive advantages. The Clone Warriors demonstrated capabilities that surprised Imperial commanders accustomed to facing Terran gene trash. These defenders moved with coordinated precision that reflected their genetic conditioning, employing tactics that exploited Luna's low gravity and the enclosed nature of the crater cities. Heavy assault clones armed with conversion beamers destroyed entire Thunder Warrior squads, their enhanced strength allowing them to wield weapons that would have crippled baseline humans. The Siege of Artemisium became the focal point of the Luna campaigns, a protracted struggle that consumed months and cost thousands of lives on both sides. The crater city's defenses held against repeated Imperial assaults, with Thunder Warriors breaking themselves against gene-locked barriers and automated weapon systems. The Selenar had designed Artemisium to withstand exactly this type of attack, and their preparations proved devastatingly effective. Chokepoints funneled attackers into killing zones where massed fire could cut them down, while blast doors sealed off breach sections and prevented Imperial forces from exploiting their penetrations. The Thunder Warriors possessed superior individual combat capability, but the Selenar's defensive architecture negated much of that advantage. The Gene-Cults deployed specialized defensive forces created specifically to counter transhuman threats. Neurotoxin-adapted clones carried weapons that delivered genetic poisons designed to exploit the metabolic vulnerabilities created by Thunder Warriors' augmentation. These toxins attacked the enhanced physiology that made Thunder Warriors so formidable, triggering cascade failures in their modified organs and causing agonizing deaths. Psycho-conditioned assault units showed no fear when facing enemies who towered over them, their genetic programming suppressing survival instincts that would have broken normal troops. These units accepted catastrophic casualties to achieve their objectives, throwing themselves at Thunder Warriors' positions with suicidal determination. The Selenar also unleashed genetic abominations that they had kept sealed in the deepest bio-vaults, creatures that represented the darkest extremes of their craft. These beings defied easy categorization, their bodies warped by modifications that prioritized combat effectiveness over any pretense of humanity. Some possessed multiple limbs tipped with bioweapons that sprayed acid or injected paralyzing venoms. Others featured hyper-accelerated metabolisms that gave them brief periods of superhuman speed before their bodies burned out and collapsed. The Gene-Cults deployed these abominations as expendable shock troops, releasing them into contested areas where they would rampage until killed, or until their unstable genetics caused fatal organ failure. The underground fortress complexes proved even more difficult to assault than the surface installations. Imperial forces that breached the outer defenses found themselves fighting through kilometers of corridors where every intersection might conceal an ambush, and every chamber could become a death trap. The Selenar activated ancient defense systems that filled passages with toxic gas or subjected attackers to radiation bursts that overwhelmed even Thunder Warriors' resistance. Automated turrets tracked targets through walls using Dark Age sensor technology, firing armor-piercing rounds through supposedly solid barriers. The fortress complexes became meat grinders that consumed Thunder Warriors by the hundreds, their enhanced physiology proving insufficient against the accumulated lethality of Selenar defenses. The Emperor's forces adapted their tactics as the campaigns progressed, learning from early failures and developing new approaches to overcome Selenar resistance. Specialized assault units equipped with void warfare gear bypass surface defenses entirely, cutting through Luna's crust to access the fortress complexes from unexpected angles. These units included some of the first proto-Astartes, warriors who represented the next evolution of the Emperor's super soldier program. Unlike the crude Thunder Warriors, these proto-Astartes demonstrated enhanced tactical thinking and the ability to operate independently for extended periods. They infiltrated Selenar facilities through maintenance tunnels and forgotten access shafts, striking at critical infrastructure and disrupting the Gene-Cults' coordinated defense. The proto-Astartes proved particularly effective against Selenar clone warriors, their superior genetics and enhanced cognitive function, allowing them to outthink opponents who relied heavily on programmed responses. Where Thunder Warriors had simply battered against Selenar defenses with brute force, the proto-Astartes identified weaknesses and exploited them with surgical precision. They targeted command nodes and communication centers, disrupting the coordination that made Selenar defenses so effective. They seized gene-locked access points and held them against counterattacks, establishing footholds deep within the fortress complexes that conventional forces could reinforce. The turning point in the Luna campaigns came when Imperial forces penetrated the outer biovaults beneath Artemisium, threatening the genetic repositories that represented the Selenar's most valuable assets. The Gene-Cults faced a stark choice: continue resistance and risk destruction of irreplaceable genetic archives, or negotiate surrender while they still possessed bargaining power. The matriarchs understood that the Emperor wanted their knowledge intact, that the threat to the repositories gave them leverage despite their military disadvantage. They initiated contact with Imperial representatives, proposing terms that would preserve Selenar expertise while acknowledging Imperial sovereignty over Luna. The negotiations proceeded through intermediaries, with neither side willing to show weakness through direct communication. The Selenar demanded guarantees of limited autonomy, insisting that they maintain control over their fortress complexes and continue their genetic research without Imperial interference. They offered their services and access to their genetic archives in exchange for these concessions, arguing that the Emperor would gain more through cooperation than conquest. Imperial negotiators countered with demands for complete transparency, requiring that the Selenar open their facilities to Imperial inspection and submit their work to oversight by the Emperor's own gene rights. The final terms reflected compromise born of mutual necessity rather than trust or goodwill. The Selenar would acknowledge Imperial authority and provide their expertise for Imperial projects, particularly the development of the Space Marine legions. They would grant access to their genetic archives and training facilities, allowing Imperial gene rights to study Selenar techniques. In exchange, the Gene-Cults would maintain operational control over their fortress complexes and continue their research programs subject to Imperial approval. The Selenar would retain their internal hierarchy and governance structures, though ultimate authority would rest with the Emperor's representatives on Luna. The integration process began immediately after the surrender, with Imperial officials establishing oversight offices within the major crater cities and proto-Astartes garrisons, taking positions throughout the fortress complexes. The Selenar found themselves subject to constant monitoring, their activities scrutinized by Imperial observers who reported directly to Terra. The Gene-Cults chafed under these restrictions, resenting the presence of outsiders within facilities that had remained exclusively Selenar for millennia. The matriarchs maintained outward compliance while working to preserve as much independence as possible, exploiting ambiguities in the surrender terms and cultivating relationships with Imperial officials who might prove sympathetic to Selenar interests. The Emperor's gene rights began studying Selenar techniques within weeks of the surrender, establishing joint research facilities where Imperial and Selenar practitioners could collaborate on the Space Marine project. These facilities operated under heavy security, with both sides maintaining careful control over what information they shared. The Selenar provided access to their accelerated gestation techniques and genetic memory imprinting methods, technologies that would prove crucial for producing Space Marines in the numbers required for galactic conquest. They demonstrated their gene-locked security systems and offered templates for enhanced warriors that could serve as foundation stock for Legion recruitment. The collaboration proved difficult despite the formal terms of surrender. The Selenar resented Imperial demands for transparency, while the Emperor's representatives distrusted Gene-Cults who had spent centuries operating according to their own priorities. Disagreements arose over methodology, with Imperial gene rights favoring approaches that differed from Selenar traditions. The matriarchs complained that Imperial oversight stifled innovation and prevented them from pursuing promising research directions. Imperial officials countered that the Selenar showed insufficient concern for the stability and reliability of their creations, prioritizing capability over safety margins. The fortress complexes themselves underwent significant modifications as Imperial forces established permanent presence on Luna. New security checkpoints appeared alongside existing gene locks, manned by proto-Astartes who monitored all movement through the facilities. Imperial communication systems supplemented Selenar networks, ensuring that Terra maintained constant contact with its representatives on the Moon. Some sections of the fortress complexes were sealed off entirely, designated as restricted zones where only Imperial personnel could operate. The Selenar protested these changes as violations of their negotiated autonomy, but lacked the leverage to prevent Imperial expansion of control. The Emperor's genetic projects required expertise that exceeded even his own formidable capabilities, though the extent to which he relied on external assistance remains a matter of scholarly debate and deliberate obfuscation. The Selenar Gene-Cults brought millennia of accumulated knowledge to the laboratories on Terra, where the Imperium's transhuman programs took shape, their techniques refined through countless generations of practical application. The Gene-Cults had spent the age of strife perfecting methods for creating enhanced humans, developing processes that could produce consistent results across thousands of subjects. This practical experience complemented the Emperor's theoretical understanding, providing empirical data and proven methodologies that accelerated research that might otherwise have required decades of trial and error. The recruitment of Selenar personnel began systematically after Luna's integration into the nascent Imperium. Imperial officials identified Gene-Cults whose specializations aligned with the Emperor's priorities, selecting practitioners with expertise in accelerated gestation, genetic memory imprinting, and transhuman enhancement. These selected individuals received orders to relocate to Terra, where they would join research teams working in facilities beneath the Himalayan mountains. The matriarchs protested these recruitments as violations of their negotiated autonomy, arguing that the wholesale transfer of their most skilled practitioners would cripple Luna's Gene-Cults. Imperial representatives countered that the surrender terms explicitly required Selenar cooperation with Imperial projects, and that the Gene-Cults would return to Luna once their services were no longer needed. The Terran facilities where Selenar Gene-Cults found themselves working dwarfed anything that existed on Luna. The Emperor had constructed vast underground complexes specifically for his genetic research, installations that incorporated Dark Age technology recovered from across Terra during the Unification Wars. These laboratories featured equipment that the Selenar had only encountered in fragmentary records, functioning examples of gene manipulation devices that predated the Age of Strife. The scale of resources devoted to the Emperor's projects impressed even the most senior matriarchs, demonstrating a commitment to genetic science that exceeded anything the Gene-Cults had achieved despite their centuries of work. The Selenar contributions to transhuman enhancement programs focused primarily on solving practical challenges that had plagued early attempts at creating super soldiers. The Thunder Warriors had demonstrated the potential of genetic augmentation, but suffered from severe instability that limited their operational lifespan and made them unsuitable for long-term deployment. The Emperor's own Gene-Cults had struggled to develop enhancement protocols that could produce warriors with Thunder Warrior capabilities, while maintaining genetic stability across decades of service. The Selenar brought techniques for genetic stabilization that they had refined through their work, creating long-lived enhanced bloodlines, methods that could suppress the cascade failures that destroyed Thunder Warriors after relatively brief periods. The accelerated gestation techniques that the Selenar had perfected proved particularly valuable for the Space Marine project. The Emperor required the ability to produce transhuman warriors in substantial numbers within reasonable timeframes, a goal that conventional gestation periods could not support. The Selenar demonstrated their methods for compressing development cycles while maintaining proper organ formation and neurological development, sharing protocols that had taken them centuries to optimize. These techniques required constant monitoring and adjustment throughout the gestation period, with Gene-Cults making thousands of minor corrections to prevent developmental abnormalities. The Selenar trained Imperial practitioners in these methods, teaching them to recognize the subtle indicators that preceded catastrophic failures and to intervene before problems became irreversible. Genetic memory imprinting technology transferred from Selenar archives to Imperial facilities provided the foundation for the hypno-indoctrination systems that would become standard in Space Marine creation. The Gene-Cults had developed sophisticated methods for encoding information directly into developing neural tissue, allowing subjects to emerge from gestation tanks with pre-installed knowledge and skills. The Emperor's Gene-Cults adapted these techniques for use with Space Marine aspirants, creating systems that could implant tactical doctrine, weapon proficiency, and cultural conditioning alongside the physical transformation into transhuman warriors. The Selenar cautioned that their imprinting methods had limitations, that attempting to encode too much information or overly complex knowledge patterns risked producing subjects with fragmented personalities or cognitive dysfunction. The contributions extended beyond specific techniques to include access to the genetic repositories that the Selenar had accumulated across millennia. These archives contained templates for countless successful enhancements, cataloged data on genetic modifications that had proven stable across multiple generations. Imperial gene rights studied these repositories extensively, identifying modifications that could be incorporated into space marine gene seed and analyzing failed experiments to understand what approaches should be avoided. The pre-Old Night biological archives proved particularly valuable, containing genetic information from humanity's golden age that had been lost elsewhere during the collapse. Some of these ancient templates included enhancement sequences that predated the Selenar themselves, modifications developed during the Dark Age of technology, when genetic science had reached heights that even the Emperor's work had not fully replicated. The Primarch project remained largely opaque to the Selenar gene rights working in the Terran facilities, though they certainly knew such work was occurring. The Emperor maintained strict compartmentalization of his most sensitive research, restricting access to information about the Primarchs to a select few individuals whose loyalty he had verified personally. The Selenar who worked on related projects encountered security protocols that exceeded anything they had experienced, gene-locked barriers backed by psychic wards that prevented unauthorized access to restricted sections of the laboratories. Those gene rights who did gain limited exposure to Primarch-related work found themselves sworn to secrecy under terms that made clear any breach would result in immediate execution. The extent of Selenar involvement in the Primarch project remains contested by historical sources, with some accounts suggesting significant contributions, while others minimize their role to peripheral support functions. The Gene-Cults themselves claimed substantial credit after the heresy, arguing that their techniques had proven essential to the Primarch's creation, and that Imperial historians had deliberately obscured Selenar contributions to inflate the Emperor's personal achievement. Imperial records from the period acknowledge Selenar presence in the Terran laboratories, but characterized their work as advisory rather than fundamental, suggesting they provided technical support and consultation, while the Emperor himself performed the crucial genetic engineering. The truth likely lies between these extremes, with the Selenar contributing expertise that informed the Emperor's work without constituting the primary creative force behind the Primarchs. Tensions between Selenar methodology and the Emperor's own genetic sciences emerged early in the collaboration and persisted throughout the period when gene-cult practitioners worked in the Terran facilities. The Selenar approached genetic modification as an iterative process requiring extensive testing and gradual refinement across multiple generations of subjects. They favored conservative modifications that built on proven templates, preferring reliability over ambitious attempts at revolutionary enhancement. This methodological caution reflected their experience with the catastrophic failures that resulted from pushing genetic modification too far too fast, lessons learned through centuries of experimentation that had produced countless unstable subjects. The Emperor's approach differed fundamentally, demonstrating a willingness to attempt modifications that the Selenar considered recklessly ambitious. He worked with genetic sequences that the Gene-Cults had classified as too unstable for practical use, incorporating modifications that created capabilities far exceeding anything the Selenar had achieved. Where the gene rights would spend decades refining a single enhancement to ensure stability, the Emperor combined multiple radical modifications simultaneously, producing results that defied Selenar understanding of genetic science. The Gene-Cults struggled to comprehend how he achieved stability with approaches that their own experience suggested should produce catastrophic failures. Philosophical differences regarding the limits of human modification created additional friction between the Selenar and Imperial gene rights. The Gene-Cults maintained that certain boundaries should not be crossed, that some modifications fundamentally altered subjects to the point where they could no longer be considered human. The Selenar had developed ethical frameworks, however flexible, that distinguished between enhancement and transformation into something entirely different. They argued that creating beings too far removed from baseline humanity risked producing entities whose psychology and motivations would become incomprehensible, subjects who might possess superhuman capabilities but lacked the fundamental characteristics that defined human consciousness. The Emperor rejected these limitations as arbitrary restrictions that would prevent humanity from achieving its full potential. His vision for transhuman warriors explicitly required modifications that transcended what the Selenar considered acceptable boundaries, creating beings whose capabilities would place them far beyond unmodified humans in every measurable characteristic. The Space Marines represented exactly the type of radical transformation that the Gene-Cults had historically avoided, subjects modified so extensively that they became distinct from the species that produced them. The Primarchs went even further, incorporating genetic engineering that created demigod-like beings whose capabilities exceeded anything that could be explained through conventional enhancement. Technical disputes over methodology occurred regularly in the joint research facilities, with Selenar Gene-Cults questioning Imperial approaches and advocating for alternative techniques. The Gene-Cults argued that the Emperor's methods introduced unnecessary risks, that his willingness to work with unstable genetic sequences and untested modification combinations would eventually produce catastrophic failures. They pointed to the Thunder Warriors as evidence of what happened when enhancement programs prioritized capability over stability, noting that those warriors' relatively brief operational lifespans demonstrated the dangers of insufficient genetic refinement. The Selenar advocated for more gradual enhancement protocols that would produce less dramatic results, but with greater long-term reliability. Imperial Gene-Cults dismissed these concerns as excessive caution born of limited vision, arguing that the Selenar's conservative methodology would never achieve the results required for the Emperor's plans. They noted that the Gene-Cults had spent millennia perfecting their techniques, yet had never produced warriors comparable to even the flawed Thunder Warriors, much less the Space Marines that were beginning to emerge from the enhancement programs. The Imperial practitioners maintained that the Emperor's genius allowed him to work beyond the limitations that constrained conventional genetic science, that his understanding of the human genome exceeded anything the Selenar had achieved despite their centuries of accumulated experience. The Selenar position within the collaborative research efforts remained that of advisors and technical specialists rather than primary architects of the Emperor's programs. The Gene-Cults provided expertise and assistance, but did not direct the overall research agenda or make fundamental decisions about the nature of the enhancements being developed. The Emperor maintained personal control over the most critical aspects of his genetic projects, making decisions that often contradicted Selenar recommendations and pursuing approaches that the Gene-Cults considered questionable at best. The Selenar found themselves in the position of implementing designs they had not created and supporting research programs whose ultimate goals remained opaque to them. Other Gene-Cults contributed to the Emperor's work alongside the Selenar, practitioners drawn from across Terra who brought their own expertise and perspectives. The Emperor had recruited genetic scientists from the various Terran factions conquered during unification, incorporating their knowledge into his research programs. Some of these individuals possessed skills that complemented or exceeded Selenar capabilities in specific areas, particularly regarding certain types of cybernetic integration or neurological enhancement. The presence of these other Gene-Cults prevented the Selenar from claiming exclusive credit for Imperial genetic achievements and ensured that no single faction could position itself as indispensable to the Emperor's plans. The refinement of augmented human physiologies proceeded through countless iterations as Imperial Gene-Cults worked to perfect the Space Marine enhancement process. The Selenar contributed stabilization techniques that reduced rejection rates and improved the reliability of organ implantation, drawing on their experience with creating enhanced bloodlines that maintained genetic stability across generations. They provided protocols for managing the immune responses that often destroyed implanted organs, teaching Imperial practitioners methods for conditioning subjects' bodies to accept foreign tissue without triggering catastrophic rejection. The Gene-Cults shared their knowledge of growth regulation, helping to develop techniques that would allow implanted organs to integrate properly with existing physiology rather than growing uncontrollably or failing to develop fully. The genetic stabilization techniques that the Selenar had refined through their eugenic programs proved applicable to the challenge of maintaining Space Marine gene seed across multiple generations of warriors. The Emperor required enhancement protocols that could be replicated reliably, producing consistent results across thousands of subjects drawn from diverse genetic backgrounds. The Selenar demonstrated methods for identifying and correcting genetic drift, preventing the accumulation of mutations that would gradually degrade enhancement effectiveness. They provided templates for genetic screening that could assess potential aspirants' compatibility with Space Marine implants, reducing wastage by identifying unsuitable candidates before resources were invested in their transformation. The collaboration between Selenar Gene-Cults and Imperial researchers produced advances that neither group could have achieved independently, despite the tensions and philosophical disagreements that characterized their relationship. The Selenar's practical experience with large-scale enhancement programs complemented the Emperor's theoretical brilliance, providing empirical validation for approaches that might otherwise have remained untested. The Gene-Cults learned techniques from Imperial practitioners that expanded their own capabilities, exposure to methods and technologies that would influence their work long after their service in the Terran facilities ended. The exchange of knowledge flowed in both directions, though the Emperor maintained strict control over what information the Selenar could access and what techniques they would be permitted to take back to Luna. The Selenar who worked in the Terran facilities understood that they were participating in projects that would reshape humanity's future, though they could not fully grasp the scale of the Emperor's ambitions. They saw the early Space Marines emerging from the enhancement programs, warriors who exceeded anything the Gene-Cults had produced in capabilities and stability. They witnessed the resources being devoted to the Primarch project, even if they remained excluded from the core work on those beings. The Gene-Cults recognized that they were contributing to something unprecedented in human history, genetic engineering, that would create a new tier of transhuman warriors capable of conquering the galaxy. Whether they fully appreciated the implications of this work or understood the role their contributions would play in the coming Great Crusade remains unclear from surviving records. The transformation of the Selenar from independent Gene-Cults into essential components of the Imperial war machine accelerated dramatically once the Space Marine project moved from theoretical research into mass production. The Emperor's vision required not dozens or hundreds of transhuman warriors, but tens of thousands, entire legions that would serve as the spearhead of humanity's reconquest of the galaxy. This scale of production exceeded anything the Terran facilities could accomplish alone, regardless of how many Gene-Cults the Emperor recruited or how much Dark Age technology he recovered. The Selenar possessed the infrastructure, expertise, and established protocols necessary to transform the Space Marine enhancement process from laboratory experimentation into industrial-scale manufacturing of transhuman soldiers. The establishment of dedicated gene laboratories on Luna began within months of the first successful Space Marine implantations on Terra. Imperial officials selected sites within the largest fortress complexes, requisitioning entire sections of Selenar facilities for conversion into gene seed production centers. These laboratories would focus specifically on the cultivation, testing, and quality control of Astartes genetic material, leaving the actual implantation procedures and aspirant training to facilities on Terra and later to the legions themselves. The Selenar would serve as manufacturers of the raw genetic components that made Space Marine creation possible, producing the gene seed organs that would be implanted into aspirants across the growing Imperium. Artemisium received the most extensive modifications, with vast new gestation chambers constructed in levels that had previously housed Selenar commercial operations. The Gene-Cults cleared these spaces of existing equipment and subjects, relocating their own projects to less desirable locations to accommodate Imperial requirements. The new facilities incorporated technologies that the Selenar had never encountered before, gene-forging equipment that operated on principles the Gene-Rights struggled to comprehend fully. Imperial tech adepts supervised the installation of this equipment, working alongside Selenar technicians who provided expertise on integrating new systems with Luna's existing infrastructure. The resulting laboratories combined Selenar practical knowledge with Imperial technological advancement, creating production facilities capable of generating gene seed organs in quantities that would have seemed impossible just years earlier. The gene seed cultivation process required meticulous attention to environmental conditions and precise control over developmental parameters. Each organ type demanded specific protocols, with the progenoid glands that would generate future gene seed requiring particularly careful handling. The Selenar adapted their accelerated gestation techniques to gene seed production, developing methods that could mature organs in compressed timeframes while maintaining the genetic stability essential for successful implantation. The Gene-Rights learned to work with the Emperor's genetic templates, studying the complex sequences that encoded space marine capabilities and understanding how these sequences express themselves during organ development. The progenoid glands presented unique challenges that tested even Selenar expertise. These organs served as repositories for the complete gene seed of a space marine, containing all the genetic information necessary to create the specialized organs that would transform an aspirant into a transhuman warrior. The progenoids had to develop with absolute fidelity to their templates, as any deviation would propagate through future generations of space marines created from their gene seed. The Selenar implemented quality control protocols that subjected developing progenoids to constant genetic analysis, comparing their sequences against master templates and identifying any mutations or transcription errors. Gene-Rights monitored thousands of developmental markers simultaneously, tracking the expression of specific genes and verifying that organ structures formed correctly. The scale of gene seed production ramped up steadily as the Great Crusade gathered momentum and the Space Marine legions expanded to meet the demands of galactic conquest. What began as experimental batches of a few dozen organs grew into industrial operations, producing thousands of gene seed components monthly. The Selenar facilities on Luna operated continuously, with Gene-Rights working in shifts that ensured 24-hour coverage of critical cultivation processes. Gestation tanks lined kilometer-long corridors, each containing developing organs at various stages of maturity. Automated monitoring systems tracked every tank, alerting technicians to any deviations from expected parameters and logging vast quantities of data that would be analyzed to refine future production runs. The Selenar innovations in gene seed implantation techniques emerged from their centuries of experience with organ transplantation and rejection management. The Gene-Cults had long understood that introducing foreign biological material into a human body triggered immune responses that could destroy the transplanted tissue unless properly managed. Space Marine gene seed organs posed particularly severe challenges because they were not simply foreign tissue, but actively transforming components that would fundamentally alter the recipient's physiology. The Selenar developed preconditioning protocols that prepared aspirants' bodies for implantation, using targeted chemical treatments and genetic modifications to suppress immune responses that would reject the incoming organs. The rejection mitigation techniques that the Selenar refined drew on their knowledge of creating enhanced bloodlines that maintained stability across generations. They understood how to identify genetic markers that predicted compatibility between donor organs and recipient physiology, allowing them to screen aspirants and match them with gene seed most likely to integrate successfully. The Gene-Rights developed immune suppression regimens calibrated specifically for Space Marine implantation, treatments that dampened rejection responses without compromising the aspirant's ability to survive the transformation process. These protocols required precise timing and dosage, with gene rights monitoring aspirants throughout implantation and adjusting treatments based on individual responses. The stabilization of Astartes organs represented perhaps the Selenar's most significant contribution to space marine development. The Emperor's original templates produced organs with capabilities that exceeded anything the Gene-Cults had achieved, but early versions suffered from instability that caused complications during and after implantation. Some organs grew too rapidly, overwhelming the aspirant's existing physiology and causing catastrophic organ failure. Others failed to integrate properly, remaining isolated from the recipient's biological systems rather than forming the necessary connections. The Selenar analyzed these failures systematically, identifying the genetic sequences responsible for instability and developing modifications that would produce more reliable results. The osmodula, the organ responsible for strengthening and restructuring the space marine skeleton, required extensive Selenar refinement before it could be deployed reliably. Early versions caused uncontrolled bone growth that deformed aspirants and produced skeletal structures too brittle to support the enhanced musculature that other organs would create. The Selenar introduced regulatory sequences that controlled the osmodula's growth factors, ensuring that bone enhancement proceeded at rates the aspirant's body could accommodate. They developed protocols for monitoring calcium metabolism and mineral absorption, preventing the deficiencies that had caused skeletal failures in early subjects. The refined osmodula still transformed aspirant skeletons dramatically, but it did so in ways that produced functional results rather than crippling deformities. The biscopia and omophagia organs benefited similarly from Selenar intervention. The biscopia, which enhanced muscle growth and strength, initially produced subjects whose muscular development outpaced their cardiovascular capacity, creating warriors who possessed tremendous strength but lacked the endurance for sustained combat. The Selenar introduced modifications that synchronized muscle enhancement with cardiovascular development, ensuring that space marines could maintain their enhanced strength over extended periods. The omophagia, which allowed space marines to gain information by consuming flesh, proved unstable in early versions, sometimes triggering neurological damage or psychological breakdown. The gene rights refined the organ's connection to the recipient's nervous system, creating more reliable pathways for the information transfer that made the omophagia valuable for intelligence gathering. The training programs that the Selenar established for Imperial gene rights and the apothecaries who would maintain Space Marine gene seed represented a systematic transfer of knowledge unprecedented in the Gene-Cults' history. The Selenar had traditionally guarded their techniques jealously, revealing their methods only to initiates who underwent years of conditioning to ensure loyalty. The Imperial requirements forced them to teach their craft to outsiders who would never join the Gene-Cults, practitioners who would take Selenar knowledge and apply it in contexts beyond Gene-Cult control. The matriarchs resented this forced transparency, but recognized that cooperation remained preferable to the alternatives the Emperor might impose if they proved recalcitrant. The training facilities established within Artemisium and other major crater cities accommodated hundreds of students simultaneously, Imperial gene rights selected for their aptitude and sent to Luna for intensive instruction in Selenar methods. These students came from diverse backgrounds, some recruited from the remnants of Terran gene forges, while others represented entirely new practitioners trained in Imperial facilities from the beginning of their careers. The Selenar instructors taught them the fundamentals of gene seed cultivation, demonstrating proper techniques for maintaining gestation environments and monitoring organ development. The students learned to operate the sophisticated equipment that filled the gene laboratories, mastering the controls that regulated temperature, nutrient delivery, and chemical composition in the gestation tanks. The curriculum emphasized practical skills over theoretical knowledge, reflecting the Selenar's pragmatic approach to genetic science. Students spent long hours in the laboratories, working directly with developing gene seed under the supervision of experienced gene wrights. They learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated healthy development or presaged problems, developing the intuition that came only through repeated exposure to the cultivation process. The Selenar taught them diagnostic techniques, showing them how to analyze genetic samples and identify deviations from template specifications. Students practiced quality control procedures, examining completed organs and determining whether they met the standards required for implantation or should be rejected as flawed. The apothecaries who would serve in the Space Marine legions received specialized training focused on gene seed maintenance and recovery. These warriors needed to understand not just how to implant gene seed organs, but how to extract and preserve them from fallen Space Marines, ensuring that the precious genetic material could be recovered and used to create new warriors. The Selenar taught them proper extraction techniques, demonstrating the surgical procedures necessary to remove progenitor glands without damaging the gene seed they contained. The apothecaries learned preservation protocols, methods for storing extracted gene seed in conditions that would maintain its viability until it could be implanted into new aspirants. The gene wrights emphasized the importance of genetic purity, teaching the apothecaries to recognize signs of gene seed degradation or mutation. They explained how to perform genetic analysis in field conditions, using portable equipment to verify that recovered gene seed remained true to its legion's template. The training covered emergency procedures for situations where gene seed might be compromised, protocols for attempting to salvage partially damaged material, or making difficult decisions about when genetic corruption had progressed too far for recovery to be worthwhile. The Selenar stressed that maintaining gene seed purity represented a sacred duty, that the genetic legacy of the legions depended on rigorous quality control at every stage of the cultivation and implantation process. The Selenar maintained certain proprietary secrets despite the comprehensive training they provided to Imperial personnel. The Gene-Cults refused to share some of their most sophisticated techniques, arguing that these methods represented core intellectual property that they could not reveal without destroying their value as Imperial assets. The matriarchs claimed that complete transparency would eliminate any reason for the Imperium to preserve Selenar independence, that maintaining exclusive knowledge of certain procedures ensured their continued relevance. Imperial officials accepted these limitations grudgingly, recognizing that pushing too hard might provoke resistance that would disrupt gene seed production at a critical phase of legion expansion. The specific secrets that the Selenar withheld focused primarily on advanced genetic analysis techniques and certain aspects of their quality control protocols. The Gene-Cults possessed methods for detecting subtle genetic variations that Imperial equipment could not identify, capabilities that allowed them to recognize problems before they became apparent through conventional testing. They maintained proprietary databases of genetic markers associated with successful implantations, information compiled across thousands of cases that gave them advantages in predicting compatibility and optimizing gene seed assignment. The Selenar shared enough knowledge to enable Imperial gene wrights to perform basic cultivation and maintenance, but retain the expertise necessary for the most sophisticated aspects of gene seed production. The relationship between Selenar gene wrights and Imperial apothecaries evolved from initial suspicion into grudging mutual respect, as both groups recognized their shared investment in Space Marine success. The gene wrights appreciated the apothecaries' dedication to maintaining genetic purity and their willingness to learn complex procedures despite lacking the Selenar's centuries of accumulated experience. The apothecaries valued the gene wrights' expertise and their ability to solve problems that exceeded Imperial capabilities. This professional respect never translated into genuine friendship or trust, but it created functional working relationships that served the Great Crusade's needs. The production quotas imposed on Selenar facilities increased relentlessly as the legions expanded and casualties mounted during the early decades of the Great Crusade. The gene laboratories operated at maximum capacity, with every available gestation tank devoted to gene seed cultivation and every qualified gene right assigned to production duties. The Selenar recruited additional personnel from their own population, training new gene rights in accelerated programs that compressed years of traditional instruction into months of intensive study. The quality of these rapidly trained practitioners varied considerably, with some proving capable, while others made errors that resulted in flawed gene seed and wasted resources. The matriarchs accepted these inefficiencies as unavoidable consequences of the production demands, calculating that maintaining output levels justified higher failure rates. The gene seed produced in Luna's laboratories supplied all 20 Space Marine legions during the Great Crusade's expansion phase, though production volumes varied significantly between legions based on their sizes and casualty rates. Some legions required relatively modest gene seed supplies, their careful operational practices, and lower casualty rates, meaning they needed replacement organs only occasionally. Others consumed gene seed voraciously, their aggressive tactics and high attrition requiring constant resupply to maintain strength. The Selenar tracked these patterns carefully, adjusting production allocations to ensure that no legion faced critical shortages while avoiding wasteful overproduction for legions with adequate reserves. The quality control standards that the Selenar implemented for gene seed production exceeded anything they had applied to their previous work. Every organ underwent multiple rounds of genetic analysis before being certified for implantation, with teams of gene rights reviewing test results and verifying that specifications had been met. The Selenar rejected organs that showed even minor deviations from template standards, understanding that genetic flaws in gene seed would propagate through future generations of Space Marines and potentially compromise entire bloodlines. The rejected organs were destroyed rather than being used for secondary purposes, eliminating any possibility that substandard genetic material might enter Legion gene seed pools through irregular channels. The Selenar facilities maintained detailed records of every gene seed organ they produced, creating archives that tracked individual components from initial cultivation through delivery to Legion apothecaries. These records documented the genetic lineage of each organ, identifying which master templates had been used and recording any variations that had occurred during development. The gene rights logged environmental conditions throughout cultivation, noting factors that might have influenced organ development and creating databases that could be analyzed to optimize future production. This meticulous documentation served multiple purposes, providing quality assurance data that verified proper procedures had been followed while creating historical records that would prove valuable for long-term gene seed management. The integration of Selenar gene laboratories into the broader Imperial infrastructure required coordination between Luna's Gene-Cults and numerous other organizations involved in Space Marine creation and maintenance. The Selenar worked with Imperial logistics offices to schedule gene seed deliveries, coordinating shipments that would reach Legion apothecaries when needed without creating excess inventory that might degrade in storage. They collaborated with the training facilities on Terra and other worlds where aspirants underwent transformation, ensuring that gene seed supplies matched the numbers of candidates ready for implantation. The gene rights communicated regularly with Legion command structures, receiving feedback on gene seed performance and addressing any quality concerns that arose during implantation procedures. The outbreak of the Horus Heresy caught the Selenar Gene-Cults in a position of catastrophic vulnerability, their facilities scattered across Luna, while their most valuable assets remained concentrated in locations that both sides would recognize as strategically essential. The gene laboratories at Artemisium and the other major crater cities contain not just the equipment and personnel necessary for gene seed production, but irreplaceable genetic archives dating back to the Dark Age of technology. The Selenar had spent the decades of the Great Crusade focused entirely on supporting the Emperor's expansion across the galaxy, their production facilities operating at maximum capacity to supply the Space Marine legions with the gene seed organs they required. This singular focus had left them unprepared for the possibility that the Imperium might tear itself apart, that the transhuman warriors they had helped create might turn their weapons against Terra itself. The initial reports of Istvan reached Luna through standard Imperial communication channels, fragmentary accounts of a massacre that had destroyed loyalist elements of 4 Space Marine legions. The Selenar Gene-Cults struggled to comprehend the implications of these reports, their understanding of Space Marine psychology shaped by years of clinical work with genetic material rather than direct experience with the warriors themselves. The matriarchs convened emergency councils within the deepest chambers of Artemisium, attempting to assess what the rebellion meant for Luna's Gene-Cults and how they should respond to requests for support that were already arriving from both sides of the developing conflict. The councils reached no clear consensus, with different factions within the Selenar hierarchy advocating contradictory positions based on their assessments of which side would ultimately prevail and what terms they might extract for their cooperation. Some matriarchs argued for immediate and unequivocal support for Terra, maintaining that the Selenar owed their position to the Emperor and that any appearance of wavering would be interpreted as treachery. These voices pointed to the Gene-Cults' integration into imperial structures over the previous 2 centuries, noting that the Selenar had become dependent on imperial resources and protection in ways that made true independence impossible regardless of their nominal autonomy. They warned that Horus would show no mercy to Gene-Cults that refused his demands, that the War Master's forces would seize Luna's facilities regardless of Selenar preferences, and that cooperation offered at least the possibility of preserving some measure of influence over their own fate. Other matriarchs advocated for a more calculated approach, suggesting that the Selenar should maintain neutrality as long as possible while quietly preparing to accommodate whichever side demonstrated superior strength. These pragmatists noted that the Gene-Cults had survived the age of strife and the Unification Wars by avoiding permanent commitments to any single faction, that their traditional policy of selling services to all sides while maintaining independence had served them well for millennia. They argued that the heresy represented an opportunity to renegotiate the terms of Selenar subordination to imperial authority, that both the Emperor and Horus would need gene seed production capabilities and might offer concessions in exchange for Selenar cooperation. The pragmatists pointed out that the Gene-Cults possessed leverage precisely because both sides required their expertise, that hasty declarations of loyalty would squander advantages that careful negotiation might exploit. A smaller faction within the matriarchal councils advocated for outright support of Horus, arguing that the War Master offered liberation from imperial oversight that had constrained Selenar operations since Luna's conquest. These voices remained muted during initial discussions, their advocates recognizing that open support for rebellion carried enormous risks if the Emperor's forces ultimately prevailed. The pro-Horus faction operated primarily through private communications and quiet lobbying, attempting to build support for their position without exposing themselves to accusations of treachery. They pointed to the restrictions that imperial officials had imposed on Selenar research, the constant monitoring and limitations that prevented the Gene-Cults from pursuing projects the Emperor's representatives deemed inappropriate. The War Master's forces, they suggested, might prove more amenable to Selenar independence and less concerned with imposing ideological constraints on genetic research. The Selenar attempts to maintain neutrality collapsed rapidly as the heresy's scope became clear, and both sides moved to secure strategic assets across the solar system. Horus dispatched emissaries to Luna within weeks of Istvan, representatives who arrived aboard warships that took up positions in lunar orbit with obvious threatening intent. These emissaries demanded meetings with the matriarchs, insisting on access to Artemisium's command facilities and refusing to accept delays or procedural objections. The Selenar found themselves negotiating under conditions that made clear their lack of real options, with the War Master's forces capable of bombarding Luna's surface installations if the Gene-Cults proved uncooperative. The emissaries presented demands rather than requests, requiring that the Selenar continue gene seed production for the traitor legions and provide access to their genetic archives for research projects that remained unspecified. The matriarchs who met with Horus's representatives attempted to extract guarantees of Selenar autonomy in exchange for cooperation, seeking formal recognition of Gene-Cult independence and commitments that the War Master's forces would not interfere with Luna's internal governance. The emissaries offered vague assurances while making clear that compliance was not optional, that the Selenar would provide the services demanded or face consequences that would make Imperial oversight seem benign by comparison. Some Gene-Rights who participated in these negotiations later reported that the emissaries spoke of the Emperor's tyranny and the liberation that Horus would bring, rhetoric that rang hollow given the threats that accompanied these promises. The War Master's representatives made particular note of the genetic repositories, expressing interest in ancient templates and forbidden research that the Selenar had kept sealed even during their cooperation with Imperial projects. The division within Selenar ranks began almost immediately after Horus's demands became known throughout Luna's Gene-Cults. Some facilities declared for the War Master openly, their controlling matriarchs calculating that early cooperation would earn favorable treatment and protect their holdings from the violence that was consuming the wider Imperium. These collaborating Gene-Cults began redirecting their production to serve Traitor Legion requirements, manufacturing gene seed for the forces besieging Terra, while maintaining their existing operations with minimal disruption. The collaborators justified their decisions as pragmatic responses to military realities, arguing that the Selenar's survival depended on accommodating whoever held power over Luna regardless of broader political considerations. Other Gene-Cults attempted to maintain their production for loyalist legions, continuing to fulfill contracts and supply agreements that predated the heresy. These facilities operated under increasingly difficult circumstances as traitor forces established control over Luna's orbital approaches and began restricting movement between the moon's various installations. Gene-Rights loyal to Terra found themselves unable to ship completed gene seed to loyalist recipients, their products seized by traitor patrols or destroyed in transit as the fighting spread throughout the solar system. Some facilities attempted to conceal their loyalist sympathies while quietly sabotaging production intended for traitor legions, introducing subtle flaws into gene seed that might not manifest until after implantation. These resistance efforts remained necessarily limited, as the traitor forces maintained close surveillance of major production facilities and showed no hesitation in executing Gene-Rights suspected of deliberate sabotage. The attack on Luna came as part of the broader Solar War, the massive campaign through which Horus's forces fought their way into humanity's home system. Traitor warships that had seized control of orbital space around the moon began systematic bombardment of installations that had declared for Terra or refused to cooperate with War Master's demands. The void shields protecting the major crater cities absorbed the initial strikes, but sustained bombardment from fleet assets designed to crack fortified worlds gradually overwhelmed these defenses. Artemisium suffered direct hits that collapsed entire sections of its surface structures, killing thousands of Gene-Rights and support personnel, while destroying laboratories that had operated since before the Age of Strife. The bombardment targeted specific facilities with precision that suggested detailed intelligence about Luna's infrastructure, strikes that disabled power generation stations and breached atmospheric seals with devastating effectiveness. The traitor ground forces that landed on Luna after the initial bombardment included elements from multiple legions, space marines whose gene seed had been cultivated in the very facilities they now assaulted. The bitter irony of this situation was not lost on the Selenar defenders, who faced warriors they had helped create, cloned soldiers, and enhanced garrison troops fighting transhuman enemies, whose capabilities exceeded anything the Gene-Cults had produced for their own protection. The traitor space marines moved through Luna's fortress complexes with brutal efficiency, their familiarity with standard Imperial facility layouts, allowing them to identify critical choke points and bypass defensive positions that might have delayed less experienced attackers. The gene-locked security systems that had protected Selenar holdings for centuries proved useless against Space Marines who possessed the genetic markers necessary for access. Their implanted gene seed organs derived from templates stored in the very repositories they were seizing. The targeting of gene repositories became a clear priority for the traitor assault forces, with specialized teams moving directly toward the biovaults that contained the Selenar's accumulated genetic archives. These teams bypassed other targets that might have seemed more immediately valuable, ignoring production facilities and command centers to focus on securing the ancient templates and forbidden research that the Gene-Cults had preserved across millennia. The Selenar defenders attempted to deny these repositories to the attackers, some gene rights activating emergency protocols that would destroy the archives rather than allow them to fall into traitor hands. These desperate measures succeeded in some locations, with entire biovaults consumed by thermal charges that reduced millennia of accumulated knowledge to slag and ash. In other facilities, the defenders failed to complete destruction protocols before traitor Space Marines breached the vaults, seizing genetic material that included some of the oldest and most valuable templates in Selenar possession. The specific interest that Horus's forces showed in certain genetic archives suggested that the War Master sought particular knowledge rather than simply denying these resources to Terra. Traitor gene rights accompanied the assault teams, specialists who began immediate analysis of captured materials and selected specific samples for extraction and transport. These specialists focused particularly on pre-Old Night biological archives, the ancient templates that predated the Age of Strife and contained genetic information from humanity's Golden Age. They also seized research related to the Primarch Project, materials that the Selenar had accumulated during their work in the Emperor's laboratories on Terra decades earlier. The systematic nature of these seizures indicated planning that had begun long before the actual assault, intelligence gathering that had identified exactly which repositories contained the most valuable materials, and where within Luna's sprawling fortress complexes those repositories could be found. The Selenar who cooperated with traitor forces found themselves subject to demands that exceeded anything Imperial oversight had required, their facilities effectively requisitioned for projects that remained opaque even to the gene rights performing the work. Traitor representatives demanded access to forbidden research that the Selenar had kept sealed for centuries, genetic templates that produced unstable subjects or modifications that the Gene-Cults had deemed too dangerous for practical application. The collaborating matriarchs protested that these demands violated basic principles of genetic safety, that the research being demanded had been forbidden precisely because it produced catastrophic results. The traitor representatives dismissed these objections, insisting that the Selenar provide the requested materials and support research programs that would employ techniques the Gene-Cults had spent millennia learning to avoid. The nature of the research that traitor gene rights pursued in captured Selenar facilities became apparent through fragmentary reports from gene rights who survived the heresy. These accounts described experiments that pushed far beyond the boundaries of stable genetic modification, attempts to create enhanced warriors through methods that produced subjects with capabilities that came at the cost of severe physical and psychological instability. The traitor researchers seemed unconcerned with the long-term viability of their creations, focusing instead on maximizing immediate combat effectiveness regardless of how briefly the subjects might survive. Some experiments involved genetic sequences that the Selenar recognized as derived from Xeno's sources, modifications that incorporated non-human DNA in ways that violated fundamental principles of human genetic integrity. The gene rights forced to assist with this research reported that the traitor representatives showed particular interest in techniques that might enhance psychic abilities or create connections to the warp that conventional human genetics could not support. The devastation inflicted on Selenar holdings during the Solar War exceeded anything the Gene-Cults had suffered since the Age of Strife, with entire crater cities reduced to ruins and fortress complexes that had survived for millennia breached and gutted. The bombardment and ground assaults killed thousands of gene rights, including many of the most skilled practitioners who possessed knowledge that could not be recovered from archives or databases. The death of senior matriarchs proved particularly catastrophic, as these individuals had accumulated decades of practical experience and maintained personal networks of contacts and obligations that died with them. The loss of these master gene rights represented a blow to Selenar capabilities that would require generations to repair, assuming the Gene-Cults survived the heresy at all. The destruction of genetic archives during the fighting proved even more devastating in the long term than the immediate casualties. Bio-vaults that had preserved samples since the dark age of technology were destroyed by bombardment or deliberately purged by defenders attempting to deny them to traitor forces. The genetic templates lost in these destructions included materials that could never be recovered, unique samples from human populations that had been isolated since before the Age of Strife, or genetic sequences that represented successful modifications developed across centuries of careful refinement. Some repositories were damaged rather than completely destroyed, their contents degraded by exposure to radiation or contaminated by chemical fires that compromised the carefully controlled environments necessary for long-term genetic preservation. The Selenar attempted to salvage what they could from damaged facilities, but much of this material proved too corrupted for reliable use. The gene seed production facilities suffered extensive damage that crippled the Selenar's ability to support space marine operations on either side of the conflict. Gestation chambers were destroyed by bombardment or deliberately sabotaged by gene rights attempting to prevent their use by traitor forces. The sophisticated monitoring equipment necessary for quality control was smashed or looted, its irreplaceable components scattered or destroyed. The power generation systems that provided the precise environmental control required for gene seed cultivation failed as primary facilities were targeted and backup systems overwhelmed by damage to Luna's infrastructure. Production that had operated continuously for decades ground to a halt in many facilities, with developing gene seed organs dying in their tanks as life support systems failed and temperatures fluctuated beyond survivable ranges. The Selenar who remained loyal to Terra throughout the heresy found themselves increasingly isolated as traitor control over Luna solidified, and the siege of the Imperial Palace consumed the Emperor's attention. These gene rights continued their work under impossible conditions, attempting to maintain production for loyalist legions while operating in damaged facilities with dwindling supplies and constant threat of discovery by traitor patrols. Some established clandestine laboratories in forgotten sections of the fortress complexes, hiding their activities in areas too insignificant for traitor forces to monitor closely. These resistance cells produced gene seed in tiny quantities compared to the industrial output of the pre-heresy period, but they maintained continuity of loyalist genetic lines and preserved knowledge that might otherwise have been lost entirely. The siege of Terra itself brought additional suffering to Luna, as the final confrontation between the Emperor and Horus drew resources from across the solar system. The traitor forces occupying Luna stripped the Gene-Cults facilities of anything that might support the assault on Terra, requisitioning equipment and personnel without regard for the long-term consequences to Selenar capabilities. Gene rights were conscripted to serve in support roles for the siege, their expertise in biological sciences deemed useful for various aspects of the traitor war effort. Many of these conscripted gene rights never returned, killed during the siege or executed afterward when their usefulness ended. The facilities they left behind deteriorated further without proper maintenance, critical systems failing and irreplaceable equipment degrading as the heresy consumed resources that might have preserved Luna's genetic infrastructure. The Selenar who survived the heresy emerged into a solar system transformed by years of warfare, their once mighty Gene-Cults reduced to shadows of their former power. The genetic archives that had made them indispensable to the Emperor's plans lay in ruins, with vast quantities of irreplaceable material lost forever. The master gene rights whose expertise had refined the techniques of gene seed production were dead, their knowledge preserved only partially in archives that had themselves suffered extensive damage. The production facilities that had supplied the Space Marine legions operated at a fraction of their previous capacity, crippled by destroyed equipment and disrupted infrastructure. The Selenar faced an uncertain future, their position within the Imperium dependent on capabilities that had been catastrophically degraded and knowledge that had been scattered or destroyed across the years of civil war. The immediate aftermath of the Horus Heresy left the Selenar Gene-Cults in a state of organizational collapse that made their previous subordination to imperial authority seem almost benevolent by comparison. The Terran government that emerged from the Civil War possessed neither patience nor inclination to tolerate the semi-autonomous status that Luna's gene rights had maintained since the early years of the Great Crusade. The Council of Terra, that collection of bureaucrats and administrators who assumed control of imperial governance while the Emperor languished on the Golden Throne, viewed the Selenar through a lens of suspicion, colored by the collaboration that some gene cults had shown toward traitor forces during the Solar War. The fact that many Selenar facilities had been forcibly requisitioned rather than willingly cooperating mattered little to officials who saw only that Luna's gene laboratories had produced materials for Horus's forces, and that traitor gene rights had accessed repositories that should have been defended to the last. The initial investigations into Selenar conduct during the heresy began within months of the siege's end, teams of imperial auditors and inquisitorial agents arriving on Luna to examine records and interrogate surviving gene rights about their activities during the Civil War. These investigations operated from the assumption of guilt, with interrogators demanding that gene rights prove their loyalty rather than requiring accusers to demonstrate treachery. The matriarchs who had survived the fighting found themselves subjected to intensive questioning about decisions made under duress, their choices during the traitor occupation scrutinized by officials who had never faced similar circumstances and showed little understanding of the impossible positions in which the gene cults had found themselves. Some gene rights broke under interrogation, providing testimony that implicated colleagues and superiors in collaboration that ranged from reluctant compliance with traitor demands to active enthusiasm for projects that violated every principle of stable genetic science. The purges that followed these investigations devastated what remained of Selenar leadership structures, with entire matriarchal bloodlines executed for suspected treachery or collaboration. The standards applied in these judgments varied wildly depending on which imperial faction conducted the investigation and what political objectives they pursued. Some matriarchs died for crimes as minor as failing to destroy genetic archives before traitor forces could seize them, their execution justified by claims that they should have prioritized denial of resources over preservation of irreplaceable knowledge. Others faced death for continuing gene seed production under traitor occupation, their arguments that refusal would have resulted in immediate execution dismissed as insufficient justification for supporting Horus's forces. The most senior gene rights who had worked directly with traitor researchers on forbidden projects met particularly gruesome ends, their executions carried out publicly as warnings to any who might consider similar cooperation in the future. The Selenar who survived the purges found their independence systematically dismantled through administrative reorganization that proceeded with bureaucratic inevitability, regardless of individual protests or appeals. The Council of Terra issued directives that placed Luna's gene laboratories under direct imperial oversight, eliminating the nominal autonomy that had allowed the matriarchs to maintain internal governance of their facilities. Imperial administrators took control of resource allocation and production scheduling, reducing the Selenar to the status of employees within facilities they had controlled for millennia. The gene-locked security systems that had restricted access to Selenar personnel were reprogrammed to recognize Imperial officials, eliminating one of the primary mechanisms through which the gene cults had maintained control over their holdings. The fortress complexes that had served as independent domains became Imperial installations, where Selenar Gene-Cults worked alongside practitioners from other organizations under bureaucratic structures that made no distinction between the ancient Gene-Cults and more recently established Imperial genetic facilities. The nascent Adeptus Mechanicus moved aggressively to absorb Selenar capabilities into its expanding empire of technological and biological knowledge. The Mechanicus had emerged from the heresy with its power enhanced rather than diminished, having played essential roles in maintaining Imperial war production and providing technical expertise that proved crucial to Terra's survival. The tech priests viewed Luna's genetic repositories as resources that rightfully belonged under Mechanicus control, arguing that biological science constituted a subset of the broader technological knowledge that Mars claimed as its exclusive domain. The Mechanicus representatives who arrived on Luna came backed by Council of Terra directives that gave them authority to examine Selenar facilities and requisition materials deemed necessary for Imperial reconstruction efforts. The Gene-Cults protested that the Mechanicus lacked expertise in genetic sciences and that placing biological research under tech priest control would result in catastrophic mismanagement, but these objections carried no weight against the political realities of post-heresy power structures. The integration process proceeded through a combination of formal reorganization and practical necessity, with the Selenar finding themselves increasingly dependent on Mechanicus resources and support as Luna's damaged infrastructure required repairs beyond Gene-Cult capabilities. The bombardment and fighting during the Solar War had destroyed power generation facilities and life support systems that the Selenar could not restore without technical assistance that only the Mechanicus could provide. The tech priests leveraged this dependency ruthlessly, offering repairs and resource shipments in exchange for access to genetic archives and authority over Selenar operations. The matriarchs who remained in positions of nominal authority discovered that their ability to refuse Mechanicus demands diminished with each system failure and each shortage of critical supplies, their independence eroding through accumulated concessions that individually seemed reasonable but collectively transferred control from Gene-Cult hands to Mechanicus overseers. The Adeptus Mechanicus biologies emerged from this process as the primary inheritor of Selenar knowledge and capabilities, a subdivision of the broader Mechanicus hierarchy that specialized in biological sciences while maintaining the tech priest's characteristic fusion of religious devotion and technical expertise. The biologies absorbed surviving Selenar Gene-Cults into its ranks, offering them positions within Mechanicus structures that provided resources and security in exchange for loyalty to Mars rather than to the traditions of Luna's Gene-Cults. Many Gene-Cults accepted these offers, recognizing that the alternative involved unemployment and possible destitution as the old Selenar organizations collapsed around them. The integration required that former Gene-Cult practitioners adopt Mechanicus practices and terminology, learning to frame their genetic work in terms of machine spirits and sacred patterns, rather than the goddess Selene and divine genetics that had characterized Selenar philosophy. Some adapted easily to this transition, finding that Mechanicus mysticism resonated with aspects of their own beliefs about the sacred nature of genetic manipulation. Others struggled with the theological requirements, their decades of conditioning in Selenar traditions, making it difficult to embrace tech priest doctrines with the fervor that the Mechanicus demanded. The dispersal of Selenar knowledge throughout the Imperium accelerated as the post-heresy reorganization proceeded and Imperial authorities recognized that concentrating genetic expertise in Luna's damaged facilities created unacceptable vulnerabilities. The techniques that the Selenar had refined across millennia began appearing in genetic laboratories across Imperial space, taught by former Gene-Cult practitioners who had been reassigned to facilities on Terra and other major worlds. The apothecarian facilities maintained by Space Marine chapters received particular attention, with Selenar-trained instructors dispatched to teach chapter serfs and support personnel the proper methods for gene seed cultivation and maintenance. These training programs spread knowledge that the Gene-Cults had previously guarded jealously, creating redundancy that ensured the Imperium's genetic capabilities would survive even if Luna's facilities suffered additional catastrophic damage. The standardization of genetic practices that accompanied this knowledge dispersal eliminated many of the variations and specialized techniques that had distinguished different Selenar Gene-Cults from one another. Imperial authorities imposed uniform protocols for gene seed production and quality control, requiring that all facilities follow identical procedures regardless of local conditions or traditional practices. The Mechanicus biologies played a central role in developing these standardized protocols, drawing on Selenar expertise but filtering it through tech priest perspectives that emphasized replicability and adherence to established patterns over the intuitive adjustments that had characterized gene cult work. Former Selenar practitioners complained that standardization eliminated flexibility that had allowed them to optimize procedures for specific circumstances, but Imperial administrators valued consistency over optimization and showed little interest in preserving techniques that could not be codified into regulations that any competent practitioner could follow. The genetic repositories that survived the heresy underwent systematic cataloging and redistribution as Imperial authorities moved to ensure that irreplaceable materials would not remain concentrated in vulnerable locations. Teams of archivists worked through the damaged biovaults, identifying samples that had survived intact and documenting materials that had been destroyed or degraded beyond recovery. The most valuable templates were extracted from Luna's repositories and transported to secure facilities on Terra and Mars, with copies distributed to genetic laboratories across the Imperium to provide backup in case primary storage locations suffered damage. This dispersal process took decades to complete, complicated by the need to verify sample integrity and maintain proper preservation conditions during transport. The Selenar Gene-Cults who supervised these transfers watched centuries of accumulated genetic heritage scattered across the galaxy, their repositories emptied of materials that had defined their organization's value and purpose. The fate of individual Selenar matriarchs and senior Gene-Cults varied dramatically depending on their conduct during the heresy and their willingness to cooperate with post-war reorganization. Some matriarchs who could demonstrate unambiguous loyalty to Terra found positions as advisors to Imperial genetic programs, their expertise valued enough to overcome suspicions about their organization's wartime conduct. These survivors integrated into Imperial administrative structures at relatively high levels, serving on councils that oversaw genetic research policy and advised the High Lords on matters related to Space Marine gene seed management. Their positions came with substantial restrictions on their authority and constant monitoring by inquisitorial agents who remained alert for any sign of divided loyalties or attempts to rebuild independent power bases. The matriarchs who accepted these advisory roles understood that they served at Imperial pleasure and that any misstep would result in immediate removal and likely execution. Other senior Gene-Cults disappeared into the expanding Imperial bureaucracy, their expertise absorbed into administrative positions that utilized their knowledge while denying them any real authority or independence. These individuals found themselves assigned to genetic facilities across the Imperium, working as senior technicians or research supervisors under administrators who often possessed minimal understanding of genetic sciences. The positions provided security and resources, but required that former matriarchs and clade mistresses accept subordination to officials whose primary qualification consisted of political connections rather than technical expertise. Some adapted to these diminished circumstances, finding satisfaction in continuing their work even under constraining conditions. Others chafed at the restrictions and the constant oversight, their decades of experience and accumulated knowledge counting for little in bureaucratic structures that valued compliance over competence. The executions of Selenar leadership continued sporadically for years after the initial purges, as investigations uncovered additional evidence of collaboration, or as political circumstances made it expedient to eliminate individuals whose continued existence posed potential complications. Some gene-rights died for possessing knowledge of projects that Imperial authorities preferred to keep secret, their execution justified through vague accusations of treachery that concealed the real motive of eliminating witnesses to activities that would prove embarrassing if revealed. Others faced death because they represented potential rallying points for Selenar resistance to Imperial absorption, their execution serving to demonstrate that the old gene cult structures would not be permitted to reconstitute themselves regardless of individual loyalty or innocence. The arbitrary nature of these later executions created an atmosphere of paranoia among surviving Selenar practitioners, who understood that technical competence and demonstrated loyalty provided no guarantee of safety in the political environment that characterized post-heresy Imperial governance. The most advanced and controversial genetic knowledge that the Selenar had accumulated across millennia faced systematic suppression as Imperial authorities moved to eliminate research that might prove dangerous if it fell into the wrong hands, or if it suggested possibilities that conflicted with approved doctrines about the limits of human modification. The forbidden templates that the gene cults had kept sealed in their deepest bio vaults attracted particular attention from inquisitorial agents, who viewed these materials as potential sources of corruption that required destruction or secure containment. Teams of inquisitors examined the surviving forbidden archives, reviewing research that the Selenar had deemed too dangerous for practical application and determining which materials warranted preservation for potential future study versus which should be destroyed immediately. The criteria applied in these judgments remained opaque to the gene-rights whose work was being evaluated, with decisions apparently based on political considerations and theological interpretations, rather than scientific assessment of the research's potential value. Much of the forbidden knowledge that survived inquisitorial review ended up sealed in Imperial vaults under restrictions that made access nearly impossible, even for officials with legitimate research purposes. These sealed archives contain genetic templates and research notes that documented techniques the Selenar had developed but never deployed, modifications that produced capabilities beyond anything achieved in practical applications, but with unacceptable side effects or stability problems. The vaults also held materials related to Xeno's genetics and attempts to incorporate non-human genetic sequences into human subjects, research that violated fundamental Imperial doctrines about human purity, but that the Selenar had pursued during periods when such restrictions did not exist or were not enforced. The Inquisition maintained detailed inventories of these sealed materials, tracking every sample and document, while ensuring that only individuals with explicit authorization from the highest levels of Imperial government could access repositories that contained knowledge deemed too dangerous for general availability. The destruction of genetic knowledge during the post-heresy reorganization exceeded even the losses suffered during the fighting itself, as Imperial authorities systematically eliminated research that conflicted with approved doctrines or that might enable future threats to Imperial stability. Entire categories of Selenar work disappeared from accessible archives, their existence preserved only in fragmentary references and the memories of gene-rights who had participated in projects that were now officially denied. The techniques for creating some of the most sophisticated enhanced human bloodlines were lost as the gene-rights who had developed them died without passing on their knowledge to successors, their expertise deemed too dangerous to preserve in an era when Imperial authorities viewed genetic modification with deep suspicion, informed by the heresy's revelations about chaos corruption. The eugenic programs that had represented major focuses of Selenar activity for centuries were discontinued entirely, their philosophical foundations rejected as incompatible with Imperial doctrines about human worth and the Emperor's vision for humanity's future. The practical capabilities that survived the purges and reorganization represented a fraction of what the Selenar had possessed at the height of their power during the Great Crusade. The gene seed production that continued in Luna's damaged facilities operated at reduced capacity, supplying Space Marine chapters with the genetic materials they required, but without the sophisticated quality control and optimization that had characterized pre-heresy operations. The genetic archives that remained accessible to Imperial practitioners contained primarily standard templates and well-documented modifications, the exotic and experimental materials that had made the Selenar repositories so valuable having been destroyed, sealed away, or lost during the fighting. The master gene wrights whose accumulated experience had enabled the most sophisticated genetic work were dead or scattered across the Imperium in positions that prevented them from training successors in techniques that required decades of practical experience to master fully. The Selenar Gene-Cults effectively ceased to exist as independent organizations within a generation of the heresy's end, their absorption into Imperial administrative structures completing a process that had begun with Luna's conquest during the Unification Wars. The fortress complexes that had served as gene-cult strongholds became Imperial facilities indistinguishable from genetic laboratories on other worlds, their distinctive Selenar character erased through standardization that eliminated local variations in favor of uniform Imperial practices. The matriarchal bloodlines that had dominated Luna's genetic sciences for millennia died out or merged into broader Imperial genetic research communities where their heritage meant little and their traditional authority counted for nothing. The goddess Selene's shrines were dismantled or converted to Imperial cult purposes, the mystical elements of Selenar philosophy suppressed in favor of Mechanicus techno-theology or orthodox Imperial faith, depending on which faction controlled particular facilities. The legacy that survived consisted primarily of techniques and knowledge that had been successfully integrated into Imperial standard practices, genetic methods that proved their value through practical application in service to the Emperor's vision. The accelerated gestation protocols that the Selenar had refined became standard procedures in apothecarian facilities across the Imperium, their origins in Luna's gene cults forgotten by most practitioners who employed them. The genetic memory imprinting techniques that had enabled rapid training of enhanced warriors evolved into the hypno-indoctrination systems that Space Marine chapters used to condition their warriors. The Selenar contribution to these technologies acknowledged only in the most detailed historical records. The stabilization methods that had made reliable gene seed production possible remained fundamental to Space Marine maintenance, though the gene wrights who had developed these techniques received no recognition, and their names appeared in no official histories of the Legions Astartes. The Selenar Gene-Cults exist in the 41st millennium only as fragments and echoes, their once mighty organizations reduced to scattered influences that persist within Imperial institutions that rarely acknowledge their origins. The 10,000 years since the Horus Heresy have buried the gene cults beneath layers of bureaucratic reorganization, theological revision, and deliberate historical obscuration that have transformed the Selenar from essential contributors to the Emperor's vision into footnotes in archives that few possess clearance to access. The techniques they pioneered continue to shape Imperial genetic sciences, but the practitioners who employ these methods typically remain ignorant of their Selenar heritage, believing instead that all such knowledge originated with the Emperor himself or was developed by the Adeptus Mechanicus during the Great Crusade. The Adeptus Mechanicus Biologus maintains the clearest institutional connection to Selenar traditions, though even this link has become attenuated through millennia of theological reinterpretation and organizational evolution. The Biologus facilities scattered across the Imperium employ accelerated gestation techniques that derive directly from Selenar protocols, growing servitors, and specialized biological constructs in amniotic tanks that function according to principles the gene cults refined during the Age of Strife. The tech priests who operate these facilities frame their work in terms of machine spirits and sacred patterns, invoking the Omnissiah rather than acknowledging the human gene rights who developed the underlying methodologies. The genetic databases that biologists adepts consult when designing new servitor variants or optimizing existing biological systems contain templates that originated in Luna's repositories, though the cataloging systems employed by the Mechanicus attribute these materials to ancient Martian archives or recovered standard template constructs rather than crediting Selenar sources. The quality control protocols that govern gene seed production across the Imperium's 1,000 Space Marine chapters represent perhaps the most significant practical legacy of Selenar expertise, though chapter apothecaries who implement these procedures rarely understand their historical origins. The systematic genetic analysis that precedes every gene seed implantation follows methodologies that the Selenar developed during their work supporting the Legion's Astartes, techniques for identifying compatibility markers and predicting rejection risks that have been refined but not fundamentally altered across 10 millennia. The monitoring procedures that track gene seed development within an Astartes warrior's body employ principles that Luna's gene rights established when they first began producing organs for the Emperor's transhuman soldiers, observation protocols designed to detect the subtle deviations that might indicate genetic degradation or mutation. The apothecarian traditions maintained by Space Marine chapters incorporate Selenar practices that have been transmitted across generations of warriors through training regimens and institutional memory that preserve techniques even as their origins fade into obscurity. The methods that apothecaries employ when extracting progenitor glands from fallen battle brothers derive from surgical procedures that Selenar Gene-Cults taught to the first generation of Legion apothecaries during the Great Crusade, protocols refined through practical experience but fundamentally unchanged in their essential elements. The preservation techniques that maintain gene seed viability during transport from battlefield recovery to chapter facilities follow guidelines that originated in Luna's bio-vaults, where the Gene-Cults developed methods for storing genetic material across extended periods without degradation. The genetic testing that verifies gene seed purity before implantation into new aspirants employs analytical approaches that trace their lineage directly to Selenar quality control systems, though the equipment used to perform these tests has evolved considerably from the Dark Age technology that the Gene-Cults originally employed. Some of the oldest Space Marine chapters maintain fragmentary records that acknowledge Selenar contributions to their establishment, though these references typically appear in restricted archives accessible only to chapter masters and their most senior advisors. The Blood Angels preserve documents dating to the Great Crusade that mention Selenar Gene-Cults, who worked to stabilize the genetic flaws inherent in the 9th Legion's gene seed, efforts that achieved limited success in managing the Red Thirst, but could not eliminate the curse that has plagued the chapter across 10 millennia. The Dark Angels possess sealed records that reference Selenar involvement in the creation of specialized gene seed variants intended for particular combat roles, projects that were discontinued after the heresy, but that established precedents for the genetic diversity that characterizes the chapter's successor organizations. The Space Wolves maintain oral traditions that speak of Luna's gene witches who attempted to tame the Canis Helix, their failure to fully control the genetic instability that produces Wolfen demonstrating the limits of even Selenar expertise when confronted with the Emperor's most radical genetic engineering. The gene seed monitoring practices that consume so much apothecarian attention in the 41st millennium reflect Selenar understanding that genetic material requires constant vigilance to prevent degradation across successive generations of warriors. The Gene-Cults recognized during their work supporting the legions that gene seed would accumulate minor variations over time, small mutations and transcription errors that would compound across centuries if not identified and corrected. The systematic comparison of gene seed samples against master templates that chapters perform regularly follows protocols that the Selenar established to detect these variations before they could compromise genetic integrity. The culling of aspirants whose gene seed shows unacceptable deviations implements standards that originated in Luna's quality control systems, criteria that prioritize genetic purity over individual potential, and accept high rejection rates as necessary costs of maintaining chapter bloodlines. The Inquisition maintains extensive archives concerning Selenar history and capabilities, though access to these materials remains restricted to inquisitors investigating matters that specifically require such knowledge. The Ordo Hereticus keeps detailed records of gene-cult activities during the Horus Heresy, documentation that supports investigations into potential genetic heresy or unauthorized human enhancement programs that might represent attempts to recreate Selenar-style gene cults. These archives contain testimony from gene wrights who survived the post-heresy purges, accounts that describe techniques and research programs that were suppressed or destroyed during the reorganization of imperial genetic sciences. Inquisitors consulting these records gain access to information about genetic modification methods that exceed what the Adeptus Mechanicus biologis openly acknowledges, knowledge that proves valuable when investigating suspected genetic corruption or attempting to understand enhancement programs discovered in heretical organizations. The Ordo Xenos maintains separate archives focusing on Selenar research into Xenos genetics and attempts to incorporate non-human genetic material into enhanced humans, projects that the gene cults pursued during periods when imperial restrictions on such research did not exist or were not enforced. These records document experiments that violated fundamental principles of human genetic purity, modifications that incorporated genetic sequences derived from alien species in attempts to grant humans capabilities that purely human genetics could not support. The Inquisition uses this information to identify similar research programs when they are discovered in rogue genetic facilities or among heretical groups that have obtained access to forbidden knowledge. The archives also contain analyses of Xenos genetic structures that the Selenar compiled during their studies, information that occasionally proves valuable for Deathwatch operations requiring detailed understanding of alien biology. The Black Library of the Eldar contains references to the Selenar Gene-Cults in texts that chronicle humanity's development during the Age of Strife and the early Imperium, though these alien perspectives on human genetic sciences reflect incomprehension of the cultural and philosophical frameworks that shaped Selenar work. The Eldar accounts describe the gene cults as primitive attempts to manipulate biological systems that the ancient Eldar had mastered millennia before humanity achieved spaceflight dismissive characterizations that ignore the practical achievements the Selenar accomplished within the constraints of human understanding. Some Black Library texts suggest that Eldar observers monitored Selenar activities during the Age of Strife, watching with concern as humanity's gene rights developed capabilities that might eventually threaten Xenos' interests. These accounts claim that certain Selenar innovations drew on knowledge that ultimately derived from Eldar sources, genetic techniques that human researchers had encountered in abandoned Eldar facilities, and adapted without understanding their original purposes or the safeguards that Eldar gene shapers had implemented. The sealed vaults on Luna that survived the heresy and subsequent millennia of imperial occupation occasionally yield discoveries that attract dangerous attention from multiple factions seeking access to forbidden genetic knowledge. These vaults were constructed during the Age of Strife using technologies that the Adeptus Mechanicus struggles to fully comprehend, their security systems incorporating gene-locked barriers backed by structural designs that make unauthorized access extremely difficult. The vaults that remain sealed contain materials that imperial authorities deemed too dangerous to destroy, but too valuable to eliminate entirely genetic templates, and research documentation that represent capabilities exceeding what the Imperium openly acknowledges. Some vaults hold samples from pre-Old Night biological archives, genetic material from human populations that existed before the Age of Strife, and that preserve variations lost during humanity's Dark Age. Others contain forbidden research into enhancement techniques that the Selenar developed but never deployed, modifications that produced capabilities beyond anything achieved in practical applications, but with unacceptable risks or side effects. The discovery of a sealed Selenar vault typically triggers immediate inquisitorial response, with agents moving quickly to secure the site and prevent unauthorized access to materials that could prove catastrophic if they fell into the wrong hands. Radical inquisitors sometimes seek these vaults deliberately, believing that the genetic knowledge they contain might provide tools necessary for combating threats that conventional Imperial capabilities cannot address. These radicals argue that the Imperium's survival may require employing techniques that orthodox doctrine considers heretical, that the genetic expertise the Selenar accumulated across millennia represents resources too valuable to leave sealed and forgotten. The internal conflicts within the Inquisition regarding how to handle discovered Selenar materials have resulted in violence on multiple occasions, with radical and Puritan factions coming into direct conflict over whether particular vaults should be opened for study or destroyed to prevent any possibility of their contents being misused. Chaos cultists and Renegade Gene-Cults actively search for sealed Selenar vaults, seeking genetic knowledge that might enable the creation of enhanced warriors or provide insights into techniques for corrupting human genetics in ways that serve the ruinous powers. The forbidden research that some vaults contain includes experiments that approach the boundaries between genetic modification and warp-touched mutation, projects that the Selenar pursued during periods when they possessed insufficient understanding of chaos to recognize the dangers inherent in certain research directions. Chaos forces that obtain access to these materials gain capabilities that exceed what conventional genetic modification can achieve, creating enhanced cultists whose abilities reflect both Selenar expertise and demonic corruption. The Inquisition maintains constant vigilance for signs that Chaos forces have breached Selenar vaults, understanding that the combination of ancient genetic knowledge and warp corruption could produce threats requiring immediate and overwhelming response. The Adeptus Mechanicus conducts its own searches for sealed Selenar facilities, motivated by desires to recover genetic templates and research documentation that might expand biology's capabilities or provide insights into Dark Age technologies that the Gene-Cults employed. Tech priests who locate sealed vaults face difficult decisions about whether to report their discoveries to Imperial authorities or attempt to access the materials secretly, knowing that official channels will likely result in inquisitorial seizure of anything valuable, while clandestine exploitation risks severe punishment if discovered. Some Magos biologists maintain private collections of Selenar materials obtained through irregular channels, genetic templates and research notes that they study in hidden laboratories, while officially denying any knowledge of such forbidden archives. These secret collections occasionally become targets for rival Mechanicus factions or for inquisitors who learn of their existence, resulting in conflicts that remain concealed from broader Imperial awareness, but that can prove deadly for the tech priests involved. The genetic techniques that persist in 41st millennium Imperial practices demonstrate the fundamental soundness of Selenar methodologies, though 10 millennia of application have revealed limitations that the Gene-Cults never fully addressed during their existence. The accelerated gestation protocols that the Selenar pioneered continue to enable rapid production of enhanced humans and servitors, but the quality control challenges inherent in compressed development timelines remain problematic despite millennia of refinement. The genetic memory imprinting systems that evolved from Selenar techniques provide valuable capabilities for conditioning and training, but they cannot replicate the depth of understanding that comes from natural learning and experience. The stabilization methods that make gene seed production reliable across generations of space marines require constant vigilance and regular intervention to prevent genetic drift, a maintenance burden that consumes significant apothecarian resources and occasionally fails despite best efforts. The philosophical frameworks that shaped Selenar approaches to genetic modification have largely disappeared from Imperial consciousness, replaced by Mechanicus techno-theology and orthodox Imperial doctrines about human enhancement. The Gene-Cults' belief in genetic manipulation as both empirical science and sacred art finds no echo in 41st millennium practices, where genetic work is framed either in terms of machine spirits and sacred patterns or as necessary, but spiritually neutral technical procedures. The reverence that the Selenar showed for the goddess Selene has been forgotten entirely, surviving only in fragmentary historical references that most imperial citizens would interpret as primitive superstition rather than recognizing the sophisticated philosophical system that underlay gene-cult religious practices. The eugenic programs that represented major focuses of Selenar activity for centuries remain officially denounced as heretical attempts to usurp the Emperor's authority over human development, though some imperial organizations quietly pursue similar goals under different terminology and theological justifications. The Selenar Gene-Cults ultimately achieved a form of immortality through the techniques and knowledge they contributed to imperial genetic sciences, though this legacy bears little resemblance to the independence and recognition the Gene-Cults sought during their existence. Their methodologies shape practices that touch billions of imperial citizens, from the servitors that perform menial labor across the Imperium to the space marines who defend humanity against its enemies. The genetic repositories they accumulated provide foundations for research programs that continue 10,000 years after the last true Selenar matriarch died. The training systems they established persist in modified forms within institutions that have forgotten their origins. The quality control standards they implemented protect gene seed purity across 1,000 chapters scattered throughout the galaxy. These contributions remain essential to Imperial function, even as the Selenar themselves have been reduced to historical footnotes in archives that few can access and fewer still understand. The 41st Millennium Imperium possesses neither the capability nor the inclination to recreate what the Selenar Gene-Cults achieved during their height in the Age of Strife and Great Crusade. The accumulated expertise that made Luna's gene rights indispensable to the Emperor's plans has been scattered, suppressed, or lost across 10 millennia of warfare and institutional decay. The sophisticated understanding of human genetics that allowed the Selenar to push enhancement to its limits while maintaining stability has degraded into rote procedures that preserve existing capabilities without advancing the underlying science. The infrastructure that supported industrial-scale genetic modification has been destroyed or repurposed, its functions distributed across the Imperium in ways that prevent the concentration of expertise and resources that characterized Selenar operations. The Imperium of the 41st millennium maintains the genetic capabilities it requires for its survival, but it does so through conservative application of established techniques rather than through the innovative research and systematic refinement that defined the Selenar Gene-Cults during their centuries of operation. The Gene-Cults are gone, absorbed into imperial institutions and erased from popular memory, but their legacy persists in every space marine who receives his gene seed and every servitor that emerges from Mechanicus gestation tanks, silent testimony to expertise that the Imperium can no longer fully replicate but continues to depend upon for its existence.